favorite musical act and why?
I'd say Tom Waits.
Don't even know who that is.
He's an absolute musical genius. Has been doing stuff since the 70s, and I think he's had late stuff as I think he had an EP that dropped a couple years ago. But what I love about him, he I think plays almost every instrument.
What genre is this?
That's also what I love about him.
Okay.
It's a little undefinable. Like you have some albums like his late 70s, Heart of Saturday Night is like kind of like crooner lounge music.
Okay.
And then the next one he'll go to like industrial, like weird, like he is absolutely fascinating. You may have seen him in, if you've ever seen Bram Stoker's Dracula. Yeah. He's the Dracula's, what's his name? Igor or whatever.
Okay.
Master, or that guy, not Igor, but he's got a few movie roles. Wrist Cutters is another one. Wrist Cutters, a love story, some indie film. But anyway, he's got this voice too, where you listen to one album and you listen to another album and you would not bet $1 million it was the same person.
Really?
Yeah. Like really like jazz lounge singer to like the most gravelly, ridiculous voice.
Welcome to the On the Edge podcast with your host, Scott Groves.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, it's Scott Groves with the On the Edge podcast. This is going to be a long one. It's going to be a not safe for work one. It's going to be a political one because we're here with my old friend, Robbie. And I will tell you, just by his Twitter account, aka X account, which is anti-party, that should tell you a little bit about his politics. So we'll just start with a super easy question of why does the whole world hate the Jews? Let's get right into the politics. Because what I appreciate about Robbie is like he is a deep thinker. He is not captured by any political party. And we're constantly exchanging stuff back and forth on Instagram about like, what is wrong with society that we just can't have an honest conversation about anything. So yeah, we'll just start. Why does everybody hate Israel?
So why does everybody hate Israel? Why does everybody hate the Jews? Probably two separate questions. I don't know, but Thomas Sowell, who I know you like, economist, I know he's talked about why people hate the Jews. And he has an article, I think it's called Are the Jews Generic? And it goes into some other middleman minorities aside from the Jews as well. Middleman minority being somebody who may be like, you're not actually producing the steel, but you're the guy between that and the guy actually using the steel. And so I think what you see is a rise in anti-Semitism in countries when there's an economic contraction. So the economy starts getting worse, and all of a sudden people like the Jews less and less. And I think part of what that is it's hard to imagine what the value is of banking, of capital, of, all these things that basically took us as a species out of poverty and out of like grinding, like hand to mouth, living in a way where we never are able to save for the future and actually building capital, doing all those things. They're complicated. They're infinitely valuable, but they are hard to see.
Right.
If somebody who makes like a little like trinket, you can see what they're doing, even if that trinket isn't actually valuable. It's something you hang on your keychain. You can see the work that they did. You can see it happen, and then there's something tangible at the end of it. And I think, especially people who don't think deeply about these things, it's very easy to look at somebody who creates valuable that's less tangible, that's less easy to point to, and to say and to see that they're making money off of doing something less tangible. I mean, your job, for example, you're not building the homes.
No, I do nothing but shuffle paperwork around and put people in debt for 30 years.
Yeah, and so somebody could easily, if all mortgage brokers or all lenders or all, if as soon as that becomes a thing that's definable by a minority that is the group that basically does that, then all of a sudden during an economic contraction or during like, if there was like a housing crisis, you might see people saying, oh, like it's all those Cambodian lenders or, it's all those Southeast Asian mortgage brokers, that's who's doing it. It's the Sri Lankans.
Yeah, I think I had read somewhere that like, I might be getting this wrong, but I think maybe Chris can look this up. I think in LA County, like 80% of independent donut shops are owned by Vietnamese families.
Cambodian.
Yeah, because that's just that's the business they happen to get into.
Yeah, it's all of California. I don't know if it's still true. Thomas Sowell wrote about it a long time ago when he was talking about how, we way back, probably 20 years ago, he was writing this when people started becoming obsessed with this idea that any industry should have like a proportional number of every ethnic group and gender and everything like that. And so, if there is if a certain percentage of CEOs are of one ethnicity, or if a certain percentage of bankers are of one ethnicity, then that must be due to like racism. And his point was that obviously there's not like some deep racism issue with Cambodians owning over 80% of donut shops. It was something that a lot of it's path dependence, I think. Some of it's like skills maybe in your native country. Maybe there's a lot of, I don't know enough about Cambodian pastries to know if that just like translated really well.
Right.
Or maybe it was that randomly some Cambodians who came over here started getting into that and saw it as like a good small business that could help them grow. And then all of a sudden when we had tons of Cambodian migration, then they're looking at the community of people they know, community of people they share a language with, and they're just looking at, oh, okay, I see this path that people have carved out for success. I'm just going to follow that same path.
Yeah, because you could see a scenario where, let's just say the magic ingredient that goes into a super tasty donut, we end up finding like that's the catalyst for giving people cancer. Well, people might start to really hate Cambodians because they were dishing out the cancer-causing donuts. And when you talk about the financial industries, and I know historically, and I'm not smart enough to know when this was or why this was, historically when finance and lending and money management and trade was kind of like a dirty thing, there was a lot of countries where only the Jewish people could do that, because it's like, no, we're not going to let them into the trades or carpentry or farming. They're sure as hell not going to touch our food. But, the dirty money process over there, we'll let them do the dirty money process. And then you fast forward 500, 1,000, 2,000 years, and it's like the most valuable thing in a modern society is how the finances move around. And it's like they're just disproportionately represented in that section because of a previous anti-Semitic bent against the careers that we would let them in. Is that, do you recall if that's correct-ish?
I think there's probably parts of it that are correct. And I don't know how much, I'm sure it would be different in area to area, how much, like what industries they were allowed to participate in. I know that they've not always been able to participate in every industry. Another factor there, though, is that Islam doesn't allow you to charge interest. And over time, they found ways to get away with that, just with like fees and other schemes that aren't, technically the exact same as interest, but it's forbidden in Islam to charge interest, and the Jews were allowed to charge interest. And so that naturally became like, oh, well, that would be the money lender.
Yeah, bad choice by Allah. And charging interest is like the seventh great wonder of the world.
Yeah, and I think Christianity for a while, I think also there were, I believe that there were movements against charging interest in early Christianity as well.
Have you ever seen, this is a total random tangent, have you ever seen like the first credit card? It dates back to like the Crusades where, they're going from England to Jerusalem on horseback and they're getting raided and they're getting killed. And so the last thing you want to do is like carry all your gold with you. So there was these super ornate puzzle boxes that like one side knew how to like register it and the other side knew how to open it. And it was this crazy, for the time, just this wild puzzle, like something out of Indiana Jones. And that was like the first credit card. Yeah, so you would take it from
first end-to-end encryption.
Exactly. Like, end-to-end encryption. Exactly. And so it's like, wow, the first credit card type money transfer, or it was a wooden box version of a wire transfer because you didn't want to transfer your gold. So if you were, leaving Jerusalem and you're going to end up in Istanbul, you needed something to show the two parties that you were the one that was due this chest of gold. And that was like the first wire transfer, the first credit card. Anyway, I just think that stuff is fascinating. So fast forward to modern day, I've got a lot of thoughts on why, but there is a whole lot of people around our country protesting. And war sucks. You've been in war. Your military experience is one of the things that I appreciate about you. Like, war sucks across the board. It's horrendous. Horrible things are going to happen, especially in the era of, social media. It pains me to see children dying. And there seems to be this thing where like Israel's the only country that's not allowed to defend itself or retaliate with similar proportional force without being labeled as the bad guy. And until a couple years ago when this like kind of bothered me and I'm like, oh, I got to read a bunch of books on this and I got to do a deep dive on this and I got to read all the Wikipedia pages and I need to know about the 7-Day War and the Egypt conflict. And I probably spent way too much time doing it. And then I went to Israel, even though I'm not Jewish. Everybody thought I was going for like birthright or something at 40. I didn't really have a horse in this game or like didn't really understand anything about it. But having read a bunch about it, it seems like somebody attacks Israel, they counterattack with a fury, usually pick up land in the counterattack, and then they're the bad guy. That's an oversimplification of 1,000 years of conflict. But I'm just thinking about it like my neighbor breaks into my house with a gun, saying he's going to rape my daughter. I kill my neighbor. I decide to take his house in the exchange. It's kind of like all's fair in love and war, but Israel seems to have to play by a different set of rules.
Hey, this quick interruption is brought to you by me, Scott Groves, the host of the On the Edge podcast. This podcast is brought to you by me. I'm a loan officer who can help you with a mortgage in all 50 states across the United States. I also coach loan officers. So if you are a home buyer who's looking to get a mortgage, if you're a realtor who's looking to partner with an awesome loan officer, or if you're a loan officer looking for coaching, get in touch with me. It's those sources of revenue that allow us to produce this podcast and get out a new episode to you every week for the last couple years. So if you're looking for a mortgage, if you're looking for a mortgage lender to partner with, or you're looking for a mortgage coach, I'm your guy. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming.
Yeah, I think that's 100% accurate that they do. I wish I understood better what the reasons are behind that. And I don't know if it's just this desire that we have, that the British had before us, to constantly have the sides balanced in the Middle East, because if the sides are balanced, then you can play them off each other. It's also the reason for a lot of the borders in the Middle East that just seem like they're random. And I think there are a lot of people who think that the British just ignorantly drew these borders without recognizing tribes. I think the truth of it is you want to draw borders that create conflict within those borders, and then you pick the minority in those borders and you back the minority and you have them rule. Because if the minority is ruling, all of a sudden they're beholden to you because they need your backup in order to continue their rule. I mean, that's how you end up with a Saddam Hussein leading Iraq with an iron fist as a member of the Sunni minority in Iraq.
When a vast majority of Iraqis are Shiite.
Yeah.
You know, what's funny is after World War II, Stalin did the same thing. Like if you look at all those Eastern Bloc countries, there's these weird carve outs where it's like, well, this is the lake that most of this country depends on for their trade, water, and natural resource. We're just going to carve this into another country so that they hate each other. Because Stalin's idea was if we can have all these little nation states fighting and bickering with each other, they won't join hands and attack Mother Russia. And that's just like, that's a known part of the World War II treaties, that he fucked with all of the stands, Dagestan, Georgia, Kazakhstan, former Yugoslavia. All of those were drawn in a way that, oh, surprise, surprise, 40 years later, they're going to be doing some ethnic cleansing and trying to wipe each other off the mat to get their homeland back, because it was intentionally drawn to fuck with people.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of the issue with Ukraine right now. Is another thing that he did is he would flood ethnic Russians intentionally into some of these countries to have like a significant Russian minority in somewhere like Ukraine. And so then once it all got split off, you have, Ukraine with this eastern region that's largely Russian and creates all these problems and creates an excuse for him to go in there. Not Stalin, obviously, but Putin. But the conflict in that region, and it's hard to say how reliable the elections have been in Ukraine, but
right.
You have the eastern part of Ukraine for over a decade basically voting to leave Ukraine and join Russia.
Isn't it crazy that there is currently a ground war going on with, depending on how you rank these things, the second, third, fourth, fifth most powerful country in the world. Like this is the kind of thing that leads to World War III, and it doesn't even make the nightly news anymore. It's like people just have fatigue. They've already moved on to the next thing. The college kids are now flying the Palestinian flag instead of the Ukrainian flag. Like, we have a major superpower trying to take over, although corrupt, a sovereign country. And it doesn't even make the 8 o'clock news. It's mind-boggling to me. Like, sometimes I'll just be in the middle of my workday and I'll be like, oh yeah, none of this stuff matters. If we go to World War III or if Russia drops a tactical nuke in Ukraine, that's like game over. And whatever, just loans must go on. And it doesn't even make the news. It's not even in my Instagram feed anymore, my Twitter feed. Nobody's even talking about it. And there's still like a massive ground war going on in the middle of like where there's a nuclear silo. Like, even if there's just an accidental discharge of that thing, I mean, why?
The more conspiratorial side of me thinks that this is an issue with keeping the public ignorant and simultaneously heavily invested in issues. And so, because a lot of these issues fall apart the second you really start to understand or learn about them. And it seems like as soon as the population starts to figure out what's going on, figure out the nuance, figure out that the narrative isn't what was claimed, then they just move on to the next thing. And so, we go from stay at home, save lives to I can't breathe, George Floyd protests to Ukraine. And then as soon as people start getting disenchanted with Ukraine, then it's Gaza. And I know it's hard to think that, the U.S. is necessarily pulling all of the strings to make all these things happen. I think a lot of them are just targets of opportunity, probably, where they say, oh, here's this next thing. Let's pump this up and pump up the emotionality on this issue and get everybody really invested. And because it's the biggest thing you see in all of these protests or with people on social media is the ratio of their knowledge of an issue to their investment in an issue is just incredibly out of whack.
Yeah. I think when I have time, I'll go back and watch our old episode from year and a half ago, 2 years ago, because I'm pretty much certain we talked about something to this effect. Because at the time, I was losing realtor referral partners. I was losing business. I was losing friends because I'm like, look, Black Lives Matter with a lowercase BLM. Absolutely. Yeah. You want to talk about police brutality. You want to talk about the socioeconomic divide between black and white. That's all on the table. That's all important stuff to think through and to bring to the public discourse. You're talking about Black Lives Matter, capital BLM. This is a fucking grift. And I saw it coming right after it came out. And sure enough, everything you or I would have said 100% vindicated. The founders of the Black Lives Matter movement who was collecting money, the second they got millions of dollars in those accounts, they bought properties in like 99% white areas like Sherman Oaks, Topanga Canyon, Beverly Hills. It was all a grift. And anybody who was standing back and like looking at it kind of from the 30,000 foot view totally understood that. I also understand why people get caught up in the emotional story of this guy who dies with a cop on his neck for 7 minutes, 11 minutes, whatever it is. I totally understand all of that, but I'm like, why can't we step back and look back critically and be like, oh, some parts of this movement, really good. This is stuff that America needs to come to terms with and address. On the other side, these are clearly like communist community organizer grifters who every dollar that you guys that donated to Black Lives Matter and put up your little black flag, you changed nothing, you did nothing, you hurt the public discourse, and you donated to an organization that was a pure scam. And we can't even talk about it openly now because that's still considered racist. It's like, it's bonkers to me. And there's still a couple realtors I'd love to just knock on their door and be like, hey man, how'd that donation go? Did you see where all that money ended up going? Because none of it went to any like black families or inner cities or community programs. And like, can you either say, I'm sorry, or just admit that you got ripped off? But you can't have that conversation in America because then somebody will just call you racist louder than you can yell over them. Yeah.
And I think, the defund the police movement was inextricably linked to the BLM movement, obviously. And I have feelings, I'll put to the side for a second, on defunding the police, which I think eventually would be a great thing. But what you had is you had people pushing that in total opposition to the residents of the areas where it was being defunded. And so, you literally had like the NAACP writing letters against this stupid movement in Oakland. The Oakland chapter of the NAACP is being like, you guys are absolute morons.
Yeah.
We need more police in Oakland. I appreciate improve the police as a slogan, or
hold
whatever
the police
you want
accountable,
to go with there.
whatever.
But it's so interesting that those movements often look at the people actually affected as sacrifices to them being able to virtue signal to other people, and where you bear no cost personally, living up in a $2 million, $3 million house in the hills somewhere, saying defund the police while your security guards keep you safe.
Right.
And I don't know, it's this whole concept of luxury beliefs, I think, is really instructive and tells a lot about where we've come to as a society, where people glom onto these movements and they say the things that improve their social standing while bearing no cost on themselves, but incurring huge costs on other people.
Explain that a little bit for people that are maybe like tuning into our podcast for the first time, or they don't listen to Joe Rogan, or somebody who's kind of defined this before. Define for people what luxury beliefs mean, and then how this translates to the current, like, oh, you're not really helping anybody. You're just trying to make yourself look better.
Yeah. So the concept of virtue signaling and luxury beliefs are both very similar, but it's usually happens when the incentives are set up wrong. So, whatever position I'm in, I have the incentive to embrace a certain opinion or policy that is detrimental in general, detrimental to other people, but it makes me look good to say it. And it's a lot of these, just oversimple. I think defund the police is one of the best examples of a luxury belief, where you'll see, celebrities endorse it. And, I think being for what we've done in Ukraine, I think was for a lot of people a luxury belief. You have people like Lindsey Graham saying, let's fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, and people who seem to care a whole lot about Ukraine as a concept and as an entity that can boost their own status, their own self-righteousness, or their public profile, without actually caring for the Ukrainians that their opinions might hurt.
Yeah. It's hard enough to send, or I shouldn't say hard enough. It's easy enough to have a politician send the sons and daughters of their poor constituents to war to die. But it's really easy to send the sons and daughters of another country to die in a war against somebody who I would almost have more respect for these politicians if they came out and they said, look, American public, we're going to level with you for about $200 billion and not a single American life lost. We can decimate the Russian, economy. We can kill a third of the young men that might have been troublemakers in some future war against them. And look, this is just a geopolitical goal where we want to be stronger than Russia. We want to get cheap oil. We want to put Putin in his place. It's going to cost us $200 billion and a bunch of dead people who aren't Americans. That's a good deal for us. Get on board. I would have such more respect for them if they were honest about it versus like, oh, there's this democratic nation. Not really. Where, these poor people, not really, have no other choice. Not really. It's like, why isn't Germany or the UK donating the same amount of money? I mean, it's in their backyard, not ours. Like, we should be this concerned if like Mexico is getting invaded, not the Ukraine. So it's like, would you have more or less respect for politicians if they could come out and say something like that?
Oh, a lot more. And I think as much as I hate, Lindsey Graham, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, so I do like all those people let the mask drop very, very often, where I think I dislike 95% of all of their opinions, but I do appreciate that they're, for the most part, not hiding their opinions.
Right. It's like, had Bernie Sanders won the Democratic primary when he was running against Trump, I might have voted for Bernie Sanders because it's like, I disagree with every policy idea he has, but at least he's intellectually congruent. You know where he stands. He's stood there since the 70s. He believes in like purebred socialism. At least he comes to the table with a platform of ideas that we could debate somewhat intellectually honestly. Because like you said, he just drops the mask and he's like, I am who I am. I'm effectively a communist. And you're like, all right, well, at least we have something to work with. We can have an argument. But the people that are just so two-faced, that are like, we're going to get into Congress and we've got to cut spending and cut the debt. Oh, there's an omnibus $2 trillion spending bill that we know we don't need, but my district's going to get mine. Yeah, sure. Thumbs up. We're voting for that fucker. Yeah. And I'm like, come on, man. Like, what happened to the Tea Party Republicans? And what happened to like the blue dog Democrats who are like, maybe the debt that we've accumulated the first 100 years of the country shouldn't have been doubled in like, I don't know, 28 months or something. It's bonkers to me. And I understand politics is a little bit of give and take, and it's very easy for us to be super high and mighty about what we would do. But it just seems like there's nobody in Congress with a backbone to actually do what they say and then say what they do.
Yeah, there's very few.
I could maybe point to Rand Paul, although
Thomas Massey.
Oh, Thomas Massey. Okay. Yeah, I could go with that.
And Justin Amash when he was in too, you know, and when these guys, when they have votes that I might disagree with, I appreciate basically all those three. They explain their votes very well, and they explain like the larger reasons that they're, you know, Thomas Massey, I believe, gave a lot of rhetorical support to Israel, saying, you know, he believes that they're absolutely on the correct side of this issue. Also voted not to fund them.
Right.
And being able to not get swept up in what might make you look bad, I do kind of respect that.
Is he from Pennsylvania?
No, Kentucky.
Kentucky. Okay. Oh, same
Kentucky
as Rand Paul.
or Tennessee?
Look up Thomas Massey, Chris. See where.
I'm pretty sure Kentucky, but it might be Tennessee.
So Kentucky's killing it because they got Rand Paul too. They have some honest politicians.
I mean, I don't know if both of them make up for Mitch McConnell, but
Kentucky.
Kentucky, yeah.
So with Mitch McConnell, they're like breaking even.
Yeah. God, what a piece of shit. Like, there just seems to be no leader in the country. You know, I was listening to a podcast the other day with Tulsi Gabbard, and I was so mad at my Democratic friends, not because of a policy disagreement, but it's like, dude, you could have put this lady up against Trump and I would have gladly voted for her. You know, I've wasted my vote, quote unquote, in every election because I just keep by default voting for the Libertarian because I think that's who most accurately represents my thoughts. But I would have voted for Tulsi Gabbard, like ex-military, governor experience, you know, socially more conservative or socially more liberal, fiscally more conservative. Like, this is the person that everybody says they're asking for, but then she wouldn't kiss the ring of the Clintons, and so they find a way to stab her in the back and get her out. But I was so mad at my Democrat friends. I'm like,
Russian asset.
Yeah.
He called her a Russian asset.
Yeah, because she was willing to talk to somebody from like the State Department in Syria, and you wanted to meet with the president, Assad. You're a traitor. You're a Russian. What? Like, oh man, it's just so bonkers to me. And I would love for her and like an RFK or something to run in like a legitimate third party candidacy, because again, disagree with plenty of their views, but at least they seem intellectually like genuine.
Yeah.
And I just don't understand why the two-party system, which is kind of a uniparty system, leads itself to this garbage of candidates that we get.
You're in a more difficult position here, I think, than I am in California. In California, I will always give a protest vote because neither party are meeting that minimum threshold for me of, I don't expect perfection, but if you've got two people running for president and one of them, you know, is an F and one of them is a D minus, I'm sorry, I'm just not voting for either of them. And for a long, long time, I feel like neither party has met that minimum threshold where I would vote for somebody, but I'm in a deeply blue state, so
yeah.
My vote doesn't really matter. Yours here does.
Yeah. Yeah. In Vegas, which I live in 181 days out of the year, if the state of California is watching this, since I am in Nevada 181 days out of the year. So no California state taxes. Can you think of the last presidential candidate that you were like, might disagree with a bunch of his stuff, but I can vote for this person and feel good about it?
Who got the nomination?
No, just who.
Oh, Rand Paul. Yeah.
Rand Paul. Yeah. For me, Rand Paul. Before that, maybe McCain. Again, disagreed with some of his thought processes, and I think he was getting a little old man there, senile, not nearly as bad as Biden, but I think I could have voted for him and been comfortable. That
I couldn't have done McCain for a couple of reasons. One, I just don't think he's in tune with where the world is now or was before he died. I mean, when he ran for president, I think at that point he had still never used email. We're talking, was it 2004?
Yeah. Although interesting trivia, because this doesn't feel that long ago, Bill Clinton did not have an email, which I know that's 12 years earlier.
Yeah.
But still pretty crazy when you think about Bill Clinton was a president in our lifetime, top of the food chain, didn't have an email. Anyway, I thought that was
Yet his wife is like an expert at hiding, and
she's really good at burning down servers. Yeah, the voice of God over there. Chris doesn't come often, but when he does come, it is with a really good joke.
Yeah, she might be the worst candidate of my lifetime. Like the person that I didn't vote for Trump, but I think I was definitely a bit relieved that it wasn't Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, I just can't think of a worse person to run the country.
Yeah, I remember reading some article that the Cato Institute had put out, and it was a little bit before she ran, but they were analyzing all of her foreign policy positions, and they came up with, the numbers here are going to be slightly off, but it was that she was for 17 of like the past 11 conflicts that we've been involved in.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's really good. Like just more. Oh, that's interesting. I want to circle back to luxury beliefs, right? Because I think the most luxury belief you can have, if you're a rich, Caucasian, gay or non-binary, college-educated 22-year-old, and you somehow think that like the people of Gaza would be accepting to you and that you guys are on the same team when everybody in that geographical territory would take you to the top of a building, club your head in, and then throw you off of a building. It's like, well, I guess you can be sympathetic to people dying who fundamentally disagree with you. I don't want to see anybody die. And the idea that that would be your team, you know, like if the Clippers just had a policy of like, hey, if you show up to the Staples Center, all middle-aged, chubby white guys are going to get their eyelids cut off, I'd probably be a lifelong Lakers fan. I mean, just by default, right? Even if the Lakers were doing some horrendous fucking shit, if the Clippers were like, no, you show up, you're a chubby middle-aged white guy, we're going to cut off your eyelids, I'd be like, well, I guess I can't root for the Clippers. I mean, it just doesn't seem like there's a more luxury belief system than that.
Yeah, the left has been very good at, and I think they're reaping the consequences at this point, but they've been very good at building these coalitions of people with very opposing views. You know, the left as a political entity is basically like the island of misfit toys, or it's just, you know, that coalition of suckers and losers, which is very interesting to have. You know, the only thing you have in common is that you are able to meet a certain victimhood threshold, and that gives you currency in that area, or you know, subsume yourself and put yourself rhetorically, at least, underneath all the people who you consider to be the greatest victims. And it is weird, you know, this oppression Olympics, and, you know, you have a lot of the left is only, you know, we'll support anybody with the most victim points, and that's kind of the only real lens that they go through. And, you know, to be sure, the Palestinians are, you know, if you want to think of them as a group, and I resist this as much as possible, just putting people into uniform groups.
Because we're really not talking about Palestine, we're talking about Hamas.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about both. This is a hard problem, not to go on too much of a tangent, but it is a whole like the map versus the territory thing, where you want something that is zoomed out enough that it's useful. Obviously, a map that accurately reflects the territory at a 1-to-1 ratio is going to be useless. To have
right.
A map of California that's the size of California is not going to help. And so you zoom out, but then you run into problems, especially with the way I think that the left likes to undermine arguments, is they'll be like, oh, well, you said that this area right here is a desert, and look at this area, look at this oasis. This obviously isn't a desert because there's water and some trees and some lush vegetation here, so it's not a desert. They love doing that. And so I think it's the hardest thing to do, is to balance these two things in your mind, of being able to use heuristics, use shortcuts, use generalizations enough that you can make sense of the world, but while also keeping in mind that like this is not how it works on an individual level.
Right.
It might give you some insight into probabilities. You know, somebody from Palestine, you can rate the probability that they are for gay rights. But when it comes to an individual Palestinian, especially somebody you would run into in the United States, that doesn't, you know, you can't just judge people based on probabilities like that.
Right.
Based on things that they have no control over.
When you talk about this zooming in, zooming out, I think it was probably Stalin who was like, I don't know if he said this or this is attributed to him, where it's like one death is a travesty, but a million deaths is a statistic.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like that, because it's like when you're watching this, you can't help but be sympathetic to seeing a dead baby, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the most horrific thing. As a parent, I can't think of anything worse than losing my child to a bomb from another country. It's almost making me tear up now, because it's like on an individual level, you can't look at that and not be moved. It's impossible. It's impossible. But then if you,
it's also impossible. Yeah, it's also impossible to, you know, people don't want to hold these ideas in their head that Palestinians are both victims and victimizers.
Right.
If you're judging it as a group, and even individuals in that group are going to be both victims and victimizers.
Right.
And that's a tough thing to deal with. But, you know, it's hard to ignore that if you're taking as a group, you know, why is it that Arab states don't want Palestinians in their Arab states?
Right. Because
Muslim states.
Egypt is holding the border strong to where 1 million Palestinians can't, you know, maraud over or immigrate over the southern border into Egypt, and those are their Muslim brothers.
Have you seen that wall?
Yeah.
I mean, that is a wall.
That is a wall.
And they're beefing it up even more.
It's like 7 layers of concertina wire, and it's like you're not fucking around with that.
Yeah.
And you know what I was going to say about the Palestinian conflict is like when you zoom in and you look at the tragedy and the death and the murder of a child, it's like it just gives you inescapable, horrible feelings for what's going on. On the other side of it, I saw a debate with Destiny, who's, you know, pretty progressive. Again, probably disagree. He's an internet celebrity. I pretty much disagree with most of his political opinions, but I find him very intellectually honest. And so I like watching his stuff, if nothing else, just to see how the other smart side of an issue is thinking about it. And he said, he pointed this out, and I looked it up because I wasn't sure if I believed it. The Al Jazeera Hamas reported figures are about 7,000 fighting soldier Hamas terrorist organization, whatever, out of about 29,000 deaths. So you've got about a 4-to-1, if you believe them, civilian death count to soldier death count. And then if you look at all of the modern wars, going back to like the War of 1812, you normally have like a 9-to-1 casualty ratio of civilians versus soldiers. So when we bombed Dresden or we dropped a nuke in Japan, it's like we killed a whole lot more civilians than we did combatants. And so he was just using that as a fact. If you zoom out, it's like nobody other than Israel is trying to do a better job of saving civilian lives in what is a travesty of a war. And it's like that has to count for something.
Yeah. I think the situations where that's not true are the, the battles or wars that occur primarily on battlefields and not in civilian centers. And you think about, that our casualty figures were worse in Mosul for sure. Like that's a, dense urban combat. And if you looked at a graph, basically the denser, more urban the combat is, the higher rate of civilian deaths you're going to have. And Gaza is about as dense urban as you can get. And even worse when you have an enemy that's intentionally using people as human shields. Yeah. It's absolutely crazy that people look at it. I can see people who, haven't been to war, who haven't looked into what happens in war that much, seeing this plastered all over their TikTok, and it's maybe the first time that they're absorbing these kinds of images. And I can see them thinking, Israel is absolutely, without a doubt, unbelievably, no argument in the wrong here.
Yeah.
But yeah, when you take it in context of how all modern warfare has been conducted, it's silly to have this selective outrage. And I have some respect for people who I've heard get upset about basically every war, and they're on that beat, And so, they're yelling about Yemen for forever, and they're yelling about, the 30-year civil war in Sri Lanka nobody cared about. And they're getting upset with all of these things.
Yeah, Ukraine, Syria.
Yeah, so I would think, the people at like antiwar.com or some of the people at like Amnesty International and these places that, sure, if you are going to just make this purely anti-war argument, I can understand how you
100%
are also upset with this. But the people that are upset with this who haven't been upset with anything else,
right?
It's just it's silly to me, and it does go back to the anti-Semitism thing. I don't know if this is just something that it seems like it has always been an issue when Muslims are the victims of Jews, and it's almost never an issue to any of these same people when Muslims, and even if you want to drill down more and say Muslim Palestinians are the victims of other Muslims. I mean, over like a 10-year, I think, period in the Syrian civil war, the amount of Palestinians who were killed, where they're like bombing Palestinian refugee camps and they're starving Palestinians. I mean, you had over 3,000 Palestinians just absolutely decimated in Syria. And that's out of a much smaller population of Palestinians than are in Gaza or the West Bank. And so I haven't heard a peep about that from any of the people who are upset at what Israel is doing. I didn't hear a peep from any of these people. I mean, a lot of them weren't alive, but when Kuwait expelled 300,000 Palestinians after the first Gulf War in 1991, and it was because, the Palestinian populations that have moved to other countries, especially when the PLO was a thing, they had a history of undermining these countries intentionally. And
yeah, same thing happened in Jordan. Same thing happened in Egypt.
Lebanon. I mean, God, Beirut, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. After, you had the PLO basically set up bases in Jordan after the 6-Day War. And so this is like 67-ish. And they're going around and they're acting like, the mafia, but worse, shaking down businesses to get money to fight Jews in Israel. And whenever the Jordanian government would try to get a handle on it, they would just like kill Jordanian police and security forces. And they really had like carved these areas out of Jordan that were under total PLO control, to the point when like those famous hijackings of airplanes happened where they held them for ransom. Where did they go? They would hijack these planes and they'd go land them in Jordan.
Yeah.
And not, contrary to the wishes of the Jordanian government.
And then the Jordanian king expelled them all, right?
He expelled them all, and then they assassinated the prime minister of Jordan, and they got expelled to Lebanon, where they hooked up with a bunch of like pissed off Marxist groups and other groups that didn't like the government, and they were, a huge reason that the Lebanese civil war ever happened. And Lebanon is not recovered. It's,
and that was in the 80s, right? 82, 84, when they bombed the Marine barracks in Lebanon.
Yeah, and it's basically been on and off civil war since the 80s.
Oh, man. It was weird when I went to Israel, and then we took a 3-day trip into Jordan to go to Petra. Like, by the way, anybody who can maybe after all these people stop killing each other, but anybody who can go to Jordan to go to Petra, like, has to be on the bucket list. You go there and you're like, I haven't been to the pyramids in Egypt. I've been to the pyramids in Mexico. It's the only thing that I can think that must be as amazing, because you look at these things and you're like, average lifespan, 40, 50 years back then. And some of these things took 150, 200 years to build. So it's like, hey, I'm going to start etching into the mountain, Rob, and our children's children's children might finish this random project that means nothing. It's just a carving in the side of the wall. It's the most amazing thing. And when we got there, we had this taxi driver that drove us all around and then drove us out to the sand dunes, and we did like our day with the Bedouins out there. And it's all very cool and it's very staged. But our taxi driver, if he told us once, he told us 100 times, hey, yeah, no, the country is 90% Muslim, but not that kind of Muslim. Like, you're safe here. We have mosques here. Did you know we have a Mormon church in Jordan? We allow Jews here. And he was so like, please bring your tourist dollars. Please, we're moderate. Please, we want more Americans to come see the beauty of this country. Because when you get to if you take the hike all the way up to the top of Petra, which is pretty exhausting, even back when I was in decent shape, you overlook this mountain range and these like glacially formed caverns or whatever, like the Grand Canyon. It makes our Grand Canyon look like a miniature model. I mean, it's just so vast. And so it's like 100% on the bucket list. And this poor cab driver like really wanted us to go back to the States and be, proselytized that like, no, you can come to Jordan. It's safe. We're not these kind of Muslims.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, it's sad that he has to say that over and over again because of what's going on in some countries near and dear to the Jordan borders. It's just wild.
It's that juxtaposition with Jordan. So something I've been thinking a lot about is how, God, we need a word that's different for when we refer to the government of a country or the people of a country. And Jordan is one of those countries. I think a lot about the difference between like Jordan and Iran. So Jordan has a population base that I think has been slowly de-radicalized, but still a fairly radical population base ruled over by like the iron fist of de-radicalization.
Right.
And Iran is sort of the opposite, where you have all of these freedom-loving people who don't want to live in a theocracy, being
college educated, more Western values.
Yeah. Yeah. It's super interesting. And I think we do ourselves such a disservice when we look at countries as if they're the same as their governments.
Right. I don't want to be I don't want to be downstream from Trump or Biden. I don't want people to think that's who I am. Like, I have more conservative, lowercase c values. That doesn't mean I align with what the fuck Republicans are doing. They're spending us into oblivion, right? Like of all the things that I'm worried about, Russia invading Ukraine, post-apocalyptic, aliens landing, all the things I'm worried about for my kids, the thing I'm most worried about is debt levels. Like, at some point, debt to GDP levels get north of 100%. The interest that we're paying on our debt is now greater than what we spend our entire military budget. It's like, at some point, the population goes poor because they can't service their own debt load. That's the kind of stuff that worries me for my kids.
Yeah, I think it was Michael Malice who coined the term or coined the phrase that Republicans are just Democrats driving the speed limit. And you look back and it is funny because you look at basically any Republican position today is, I'd say like 80% of their positions today are whatever Democrats' positions were 15 years ago, which is one way of looking at it. And the other way of looking at it that I think is super, super accurate with what you're saying is that we're driving toward the edge of a cliff, and Democrats and Republicans are arguing about how fast we're going, not the direction we're going. And Democrats, want to go 70 miles an hour over this cliff, and Republicans want to go 50 miles an hour.
Right. And we're all going to die.
Yeah.
Yeah. I used something similar. I was like, you show up at the scene of a car accident. There's 8 people bleeding out. Somebody's through the windshield. There's still traffic zooming by. The first priority is not to figure out whether the car was a manual or automatic transmission. That's completely irrelevant to everything on the scene. Like, you've got triage, you've got casualties, you've got to secure the scene, you got to slow down traffic. And like, it just feels like Democrats and Republicans are arguing whether about the car was an automatic or a manual transmission. None of that fucking matters. Like, you got to stop the bleeding. Yeah. And there's no adult in the room who's willing to have that conversation. And, I've got concerns about him, but I thought maybe Vivek was that guy, although there's some stuff coming about him that I'm not super happy about. I thought maybe Tulsi Gabbard could be that gal. I thought maybe a Rand Paul could be that person. Some of the emails that got leaked by Julian Assange when Hillary was running for president was like before Trump started to get this critical mass and this steamroll of media attention. They were most concerned about Rand Paul because they were like, this guy makes sense. He wants to cut the deficit. He has like a make sense plan. And there's all this like DNC to Hillary campaign back and forth of like, how can we basically assassinate Rand Paul's character so that he can't win the Republican nomination because he's the one we should be scared about, which if you're public enemy number 1 to Hillary Clinton, as we've already discussed, that's probably the best person for the job.
Yeah, and I think too about like who would this person have in their cabinet is almost more important than who the president is. And I would trust somebody like a Rand Paul to be able to suss out and figure out who would be good to, put at Treasury, for example, maybe his dad. But I think it's tough looking at both of these parties. And in a lot of ways, you have this same situation when we judge other countries. You have this same situation going on in a lot of other countries too, where they've figured out how to give this false choice between two people that you hate both of them, but they rile everybody up every election cycle about, whatever it is on the margin that makes this person worse than that person, or this person's temperament. Can you believe that they said X, Y, or Z?
Right.
And I think like getting back to Palestine and Israel, you see a lot of that. And I think it muddies the waters of what the moral clarities in the situation are. And, I think that you can take any specific decision and maybe criticize it, but like directionally, I don't know how anybody can make the argument well that directionally Hamas or the Palestinians are in the right direction, and while Israel is in the wrong direction.
Yeah. And, Israel has plenty of political positions I would disagree with. And if I was a Israeli scholar, I'm sure I would probably hate Netanyahu as much as I hate Biden or Trump. But
they have their own parties and everything. And you know what Likud, what they, push on the West Bank, I think gives a lot of ammunition to Palestinians. And I don't.
You mean the settlements and things like that?
And basically, trying to minimize the Palestinian presence there by ever expanding into areas where Palestinians were the majorities, and you just kind of look at those areas and they get smaller and smaller. And I can't judge that too harshly because I'm not in this position where those are, that's an existential threat to the lives of my family.
Right.
But at the same time, I think it does give a lot of fodder. You can point to these individual decisions, like Netanyahu allowing pass-through funding through Qatar to go to Hamas in order to keep it somewhat radical. I mean, his famous quote that he's alleged to have said is that, we, like, it's on fire basically, but we control the height of the flame. And the cynical ploy was to keep Gaza radical enough to prevent two-state solution, to prevent peace. And then that horribly backfired on him. And that's it. From my last times on here, like, steel manning is a huge part of what I try to do. And so that's not my position, but I understand, like, those are good arguments.
Yeah, those are real criticisms
for what Israel has done wrong. And I think on the other side of that, then you have to go to the arguments of what Hamas has done wrong, what Palestine has done wrong, and then you weigh the two. I actually think that, back to kind of these college protests and just the support really for, Palestine or Hamas, depending on the person, and the lack of information there. I think before you get emotionally invested in any sort of argument, you should be able to trick random people that you're on the other side. Or in other words, you should know the arguments on the other side well enough that if I'm on a panel, this is like an ideological Turing test, like the test that they use to find out whether an artificial intelligence is good or not. They see, can the artificial intelligence, if you had a panel where you have one AI and 4 humans, and somebody's blindly talking to all 5 of these people, can they pick out the AI? And let's say I'm on the side of Israel. I don't have to say, let's say I am on the side of Israel in this. I don't think, though, that I should be sounding off unless I can be on a panel of 4 people who are pro-Palestine and trick an observer or even a pro-Palestinian person. You assign me, okay, like, you want to pretend that you're pro-Palestine, make the arguments. And my arguments should be good enough, should be convincing enough. They shouldn't be straw man arguments that person is going to have a tough time eliminating me and saying he doesn't really believe Palestine is in the right. And I think before you start, risking your graduation, risking jail time, risking all these things, you should be able to do that. And I would guess that well under 1% of the people protesting right now would be able to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's just, obviously social media can be very selective in your own bubble when you're on social media, but just the number of, like, reporter in your face, why are you protesting this? What does the river to the sea mean, et cetera, et cetera? And these college students are like, hey, why are we here again? Like we were at NYU and Columbia said we had to come down. Why are we here again? Oh, I don't know. Like the one that was the worst was the one girl literally said out loud, I wish we were more educated. And I was just like, oh God, you just gave the right or the pro-Israeli argument. You gave them all the ammunition they need on somebody who's getting $250,000 education. They're risking their graduation, risking getting arrested, turning to her friend saying, I wish I was more educated. I don't really know what we're protesting against. It's like, and you can find it on the right too. But this is the one issue where it's like, dude, you're really giving us all the ammunition we need if we are pro-Israel.
I have so many thoughts about this. The one, I'll start with this one just because it's kind of the easiest. But when you had the Tea Party, you had reporters going out of their way to try to find nuts. It's called nut picking. Yeah. Going and finding crazy people to pick. And you had some people who were racist in those protests because people who want their marginal views to be heard, they attach themselves to protests, even if they have nothing to do with the protest.
Even if their views are crazy.
Right. And so what, though, I think is a key difference here is that at those Tea Party protests, you also had tons of videos of Tea Party protesters marginalizing these people, kicking them out of their protests, telling them to get the hell out of here. Like, this is not what we believe. This is not what we're protesting. Get the hell out of here. And whatever you can say for the people who are just like pro-peace, pro-Palestine, not pro-Hamas, just pro-Palestine, saying that we're pro-Hamas is a slur. I'm sorry, but, whether you're joining in or not, you're not separating yourself when people are, cheering the martyrs of October 7th or chanting from the river to the sea or chanting globalize the intifada or, coming up with all of these very violent pro-militant, which would be Hamas or, maybe you're very nuanced and you like Islamic Jihad better.
Right.
But whoever it is that's militant over there that you're cheering for is not a good person. And they're not separating themselves. The people that claim that they just want a ceasefire because they don't want any more babies to die.
Yeah.
They're not separating themselves from the people who cheer the continual militancy coming out of Palestine and Hamas and pro-Palestinian people. And so I don't know how you square that. If you're going to pretend that you have some moral courage by skipping class and going and joining in on these protests, but you don't have the moral courage to kick the bad actors out of your protest or to separate yourself. I mean, let's say I'm going to a pro-Israel protest and there's a tiny group of people that are saying kill all Palestinians or push Gaza into the sea. If it's a tiny group of people, I would be confronting them and telling them, like, you're not what this movement stands for. You need to get the hell out of here. And if it was a large enough group, I would be like, oh, well, this is not my protest.
Right.
I am not going to be a part of this. But you don't have that. You have this weird acceptance of, under the banner often of anti-war, which has really bugged me throughout, because I considered, I don't know, myself anti-war, but a lot of this movement, it went from what Putin did invading Ukraine was wrong. Also, we goaded him into a little bit. And also, I want Ukraine to win. I just don't want to support them. You had people going from that to being just literally pro-Russian, pro-Putin. Right. And wanting and cheering on Russia and wanting Russia to win. And that's an unfortunate part of people who consider themselves under the banner of this anti-war movement. And you see the same, I think, with the pro-Palestinian protesters. And there's not really an effort to kick them out.
Did you happen to watch that interview with Putin and Tucker Carlson?
I did.
So one of the things that I took away from that interview is like, okay, Putin has already proven that he's willing to go into one country, and then he's going to Ukraine. And I can't remember if it was Poland or Georgia, but he brought it up like half a dozen times. And I immediately texted my buddy Steven, older Jewish guy, very conservative, mentor of mine. I was like, oh, if this continues, I can't remember now if it was Poland or Jordan that he brought up multiple times. And I'm like,
Poland or Hungary?
Poland or Hungary, yeah. Maybe it was Hungary. He was not Jordan, Georgia. He was like, I just remember texting him. It was like, oh, that's next. If he just washes through Ukraine and takes over, what is the capital of Ukraine?
Kiev.
Thank you. If he takes over Kiev, like this doesn't stop. There's like another country. So I'm okay fighting back. I'm okay contributing money. And I don't think it's a blank check where maybe Rand Paul had a thought where it's like, hey, can we at least put an inspector general over there to make sure that our money isn't buying new Bugattis and it's buying like bombs to fight back against Russia? It's weird that people like myself could get so angry at the like wasteful spending that I would switch sides and be like, oh yeah, Putin should be able to take over all of Ukraine and then Hungary and then Georgia and then Poland. It's just like, I don't understand how that switches so fast.
Yeah, if I was going to steel man the for Ukraine argument, unfortunately, I think that the time is long past, but I am sympathetic to the initial argument a lot of people made that what needs to happen in Ukraine is we need to, take yourself back in time a few years. What needs to happen is we need to put a bunch of support behind Ukraine to make this way too costly to Putin for it to be worth it, and then let Ukraine negotiate from a ceasefire or a truce from a position of strength.
Right.
And in the beginning, they achieved that, I think.
And there was an off-ramp early on.
And there was an off-ramp, and then we sent Boris Johnson to go scuttle it. It was very clearly something that could have ended, and Ukraine probably could have got a better deal than they will get in the end.
Right.
And now they're going to pay with tens of thousands more lives, maybe hundreds, to get worse results than they would have got if they just took that initial off-ramp. And
this is something that might make me vote for Donald Trump. I can't even believe I just said that out loud. When that off-ramp got scuttled effectively by American politicians, and Trump was being interviewed, and they're like, well, blah, blah. And they're like really trying to back him into a corner. And he just looked at the reporter. He's like, I just want people to stop dying. Yeah. I don't care if Putin has to get his, or somebody has to have egg on their face, or we have to come up with some concession. I just want people to stop dying. And the fact that was controversial just was another nail in the coffin of like how far gone the media is and how far gone people are who have Trump derangement syndrome. Because how can the potential leader or the former leader of the free world saying, I don't care. Like, let's just end it so people stop dying. How the fuck can that be a bad thing?
Yeah, Trump, I think, has one of the better foreign policy instincts I've seen in a lot of presidents. And I think we haven't had anybody like this for a long time. And so people get kind of confused by what it seems like he's doing. So you have these different ideas of foreign policy. I think Bush was much in the vein of Wilson, kind of like a Wilsonian view of foreign policy, which was a lot of nation building.
Yeah, a little adventurism.
But like building up institutions that like, the New World Order kind of stuff, that we should be in charge of these large international bodies that govern the whole world. And also we should, impose democracy on other people. So he's kind of in that vein. I think you go to Obama and Biden are different shades of a similar vein where they both kind of project peace and then do stuff that creates conflict.
Right.
In the background.
Quietly radical is what George Will called it.
Yeah, it's really weird, and it's really, it's very much the worst of like all positions. And it's kind of, it goes back to luxury beliefs a little bit too, where they're trying to assert to people, like Obama's apology tour that he did throughout the Arab world of going, of projecting what he viewed maybe as an olive branch, but what gets interpreted as weakness.
Right.
And you have the same thing with Biden is more of like, worse than that, like in the sense that Jimmy Carter was, where it's like really, really project weakness, really project that you can't do anything and on the total opposite end of that is a more Jacksonian view that I think Trump has, where it's, we don't want war and we're going to do what we can to prevent war, but also we're going to threaten a whole lot And if we are forced into doing something, like when he decided to get rid of ISIS, he just did it.
Right.
And there wasn't this like slow buildup. And I think there's this idea, it's a very American idea that people have. I don't know if it's because we watch too much sports, but it's almost like boxing. Like, we would be offended by seeing, a heavyweight champion fight a featherweight champion. Like, no, that's not fair. We don't want that. And, if it's entertainment, I understand that. But in reality, if you're trying to minimize violence and trying to minimize death, you don't want fair war. And that's what I keep hearing too from people that are pro-Palestine is, Israel is this military behemoth. They're so much stronger militarily, and they can inflict so much damage. And Palestine is just lobbing homemade rockets over there, and Israel has the Iron Dome, and so it's not fair. And so we want to side with the little guy, side with the underdogs, and it's just prolonging a war. I am convinced leads to way more death and way more chance that it can spin out of control and start involving other actors. And so the weakness of a Biden is super apparent here, where he is trying to hold Israel back in a way that some people might appreciate. In my view, he's just prolonging the inevitable, and every day that he prolongs that inevitable, that's the more dead babies you see on your feed as you're scrolling through. Yeah. The more people are going to die. And this isn't just, I'd say, a couple concrete examples of this. Why haven't Israelis taken out Hamas leadership in Doha, in Qatar? And it's mainly because, there are definitely like Israeli ranking leaders who have said this is the right thing to do, who are very convinced of it. But the United States, we have our largest base in the Middle East in Qatar.
So explain that, by the way. Qatar, Dubai, Emirates, the Emirates Empire, all of the super wealthy plush areas where the Instagram influencers like to go. Explain to people who don't know that that's where Hamas leadership hangs out. Like they're not suffering in Palestine.
Right.
They're in the Khalifa Hotel or whatever in Dubai.
Yeah.
Drinking it up, partying it up. They're in Qatar.
They're mostly in Qatar and Turkey. And Qatar is basically like the wish.com Dubai.
Or the Diet Pepsi of Dubai.
Yeah. And I've been to Qatar, and
I've never been.
It's a very interesting place. They've got, I think, like over 10% of the world's natural gas reserves just right there, and a tiny population. So I think they've got like a population of like 2 million, which is really small. I believe that these numbers are going to be off a little bit, basically right direction. Population of around 2 million, but only 300,000 of those are citizens. And they treat the non-citizens like absolute dirt. I mean, when I arrived there at night, we were driving, and just in my short 20-minute drive, 2 dead bodies on the side of the road. And I asked our driver what that is all about, and he spoke English, so he knew our terms. And we had a term called third country nationals. So these are people who go to areas where there's a conflict, but it's like you might have like a guy from the Philippines working the chow hall in Kandahar, Afghanistan. Yeah. So he's not from the coalition countries, and he's not from the country that we're in. So he's a third country national. You get a lot of these in Qatar who are doing building projects, who are doing building for the World Cup, and, famously like dozens of them.
Basically indentured servants.
They take their passports. Dozens of them died from working conditions. And these people on the side of the road, he said they refer to as a third country national, we call TCN. So they would just call it TCN roadkill. And it was a lot of these ultra rich people would just think it was funny to hit them when they'd see them riding on the side of the road. So like, we used to joke about pedestrian polo.
Oh my God.
But they were actually doing it over there. So it's a very interesting vibe in Qatar. And then you get to Al Udeid.
And Qatar is where the Hamas leadership is hanging out.
Yeah. You get to Al Udeid there, where it's a giant U.S. base, biggest base we have, and just a bunch of people hanging out at the pool. And it's one of those fake deployments that you can get, and they serve beer on the base and everything. I mean, it's a funny deal. But yeah, so the Hamas leadership hangs out there, and
party, drinking, fucking Instagram models.
Yeah,
while their citizenry is legitimately suffering.
Yes,
whether it's self-inflicted or not, they are fucking suffering.
Yeah, and so it's to an extent, the Qatari royals are playing the hand that they've been dealt, where they want to stay on the good side of radical Muslims in the region and not get attacked. But they also want to have productive relationships with the West. And so they play both sides a little bit. But what it leads to is this thing where you have...
They're bi-curious.
Yeah. You have Biden pulling back Israel from being able to wage their own war and to make decisions that could end the war faster. Another really good example of this is at the very beginning of the war, Eric Prince of Blackwater. He's the founder of Blackwater. He's a big Donald Trump supporter. And he thought that the best idea here would be not bombs, which are, you have all of Hamas hiding underground, and you have all these civilians above ground that they're hiding beneath. And he had the idea that I think was a way better idea than what they've been doing. He was going to bring all these giant pumps on C-130s over to Israel and pump seawater into the tunnels and just flush Hamas out. And that was something also that a lot of Israeli military leaders thought was an excellent idea.
And explain who Blackwater is to people that aren't familiar.
Right. So Blackwater, it became famous. They're a contractor group, and they
made some mistakes.
They made some mistakes. Did they make more mistakes than conventional militaries? I would say no. I'm kind of partial to, side note, I'm a little bit partial to private contracting military groups, just because I think, when you're in a country's military, I mean, imagine if you or I were in the military, if they all of a sudden got into some conflict we didn't agree with, and you're like, I'm going to sit this one out.
No.
Can't do it. No matter how much you disagree with it morally, you would be, you'd go through a series of steps that would eventually end with you being locked up in Leavenworth.
Right.
You work for Blackwater, the worst that happens is you get fired, but probably they just say, okay, sit it out and we'll
call you on the next
deployment.
Yeah. I'm not against, a lot of people have labeled them as mercenaries, but I'm not against private military. Did I ever tell you about my buddy's dad? This is the craziest story. Dude had like a job in the oil industry or law, like something very white collar, had kids super young. And at 40, both of his kids were older. I think he even had a couple of grandkids. And when the second Gulf War kicked off, it was after Afghanistan, we were going into Iraq. He just up out of nowhere is like, I'm going to go get 6 months of training with like these Navy SEALs and Delta Force guys and firearms. And I'm going to go sign up for Blackwater. And they're like, what? He's like, yeah, I'm just going to go be like a mercenary for like $124,000 a year. Like, I always wanted to be in the military. They won't take me now. I'm too old. I figure if I'm around like the best of like special operations, they'll probably keep me safe. They'll probably get a kick out of it. And this guy went and he was like a private contract security guy in in Iraq. And then later on in some country I probably shouldn't say, where he was guarding some politicians. And yeah, this was his job. He went from like behind the desk, no military experience, no police experience, went through like their 6-month boot camp, and he's boots on the ground, like ready to shoot. I was like, this is the weirdest shit ever. Yeah. And my buddy was terrified. He's like, I'm going to have to tell my grandkids that their dad decided to go on this adventure of a lifetime and died. Luckily, he made it back and he's okay. But what a wild experience that at 45, he could just decide to sign up to be a mercenary, quote unquote.
Yeah. And that's a lot of what they were doing was protection. Mm-hmm. You have people from the State Department or wherever who come over and they have Blackwater protect them because, I mean, you don't have the bureaucracy of the military. You don't have, it's a little faster and looser, but to their credit, I think they're like maybe the only group that's never, ever lost a protectee. So good at what they do. Anyway, and Eric Prince, smart, fascinating guy, also a big Trump supporter, which plays into this because the Biden administration gave Israel that when they were talking to Eric Prince. And it wasn't just that specific action. It was, they told them, Biden's administration told Israel that if they want basically the relationship with the United States to continue, then they should not do any business with Eric Prince. And so you think about that. You think about we're in May. I mean, this thing conceivably, with flooding the tunnels and taking out Hamas leadership in Qatar, without the Israelis' hands being tied by the U.S., this thing could have been over quickly. And there would have been people who would have bitched and moaned still about, because they're flooding the tunnels, there still would have been some civilian deaths.
Right.
There would have been all of these, but compared to what we're getting now, I mean, if you're going to have a war, make it quick.
Yeah.
You know, we should have got at, we won in Afghanistan in a month, 2 months, 3 months. We could have had, you know, we've talked about this before. We could have had bin Laden in that time when he was pinned down in Tora Bora, and Cheney basically like didn't want to do it that quickly because then America would maybe be like, well, we should go home then.
Right.
And he didn't want that. And so
instead we get a 20-year mission creep with no discernible outcome.
And the people that are trying to tie Israel's hands, I think that's what they're risking creating. They're risking this spinning off into a larger conflict that involves Iran, or they're, you know, at the very least, it doesn't spin off, but it just goes on and on and on, and more people die of both direct conflict, but exponentially people start dying of the secondary effects of conflict. You know, famine, disease, cholera, you know, is always a big one where you stop having access to good drinking water and you're just forced to make do. And a lot of times those don't even get counted as combat deaths. And, you know, starving to death, dying of thirst, like not great ways to go. But that is what the people who don't want this to be over with quickly, that's what they're setting up. And also it's a reason that I'm conflicted. Most of me thinks if I had the choice as Israel, I wouldn't take U.S. dollars anymore. I wouldn't take aid money because it just comes with too many strings. And I think that's better for us, better for them, you know, still have a strong trade relationship. I don't mind selling them equipment or things like that. But we do fund most of their enemies as well. So that does make it a little bit complicated. But, you know, we should really be pulling back from all of that and letting them sort it out. You know,
you mentioned steel manning arguments. So steel man the Palestinian side from my super reductive fourth grade reasoning. And I thought about this a lot when I was in Israel, because Chris, maybe you can look this up. I think I looked this up. The population of Israel is about 6 million, and around 1 million of them are Muslims. I think this is correct. Chris can look it up. And so when I was in Israel and I went there, I expected all the Muslims live in Gaza and the West Bank, and there's a huge wall, and there's the IDF guards and, you know, roadblocks and security and whatnot. And then Israel is Jewish and whatnot. And then sure enough, you're driving around certain neighborhoods. You got it?
Your number is 9.5 million in 2022, and 1.7 million Muslims, representing 18% of the population.
Yeah. So as you're driving around, you see these neighborhoods where there's big black water towers on top of each individual structure. And I was like, hey, why do some of those houses have water towers and those don't? And my buddy who is our tour guide basically said, well, a lot of the Muslims are concerned that, you know, they're going to have their water shut off, or there's different ways that they allow the settlements to operate and whatnot. And so some of them were Jewish settlements, some of them, but most of them were Muslims. And I'm like, wait a minute. I'm like, how many Muslims live in Israel? And he's like, oh, like 20% or something like that. And so that was super eye-opening, because there's no Jews living in the West Bank or Gaza. Well, not a lot. In the West Bank there is, but in Gaza, there's not a single Jew living there because they would be decapitated immediately. So like, again, reductive reasoning, I was like, all right, if you have two populations that are fighting and one allows 20% of their population to be quote unquote the enemy, and the other population allows 0% of the population to be the enemy, kind of tells you maybe who's on the right side of history here, right? And then I would just think about it based on all of the skirmishes we have going back to 1944, 1948. It's like, well, if the Gazans all laid down their weapons, they would definitely lose some land. There would be more settlements. But I think we have some history that like the Israelis would start to assimilate them into the economy, because we already have proof that they've done it with 20% of the people. If the Israelis all laid down their weapons, there would be 6 million fewer Jews within a month. And so it's like just that super reductive reasoning, and we can argue in the margin and who's doing war correctly and proportional response and the politics of it. But it's like just on those two things, I'm like, I have a hard time thinking somebody across from me is trying to steel man the Palestinian argument could convince me that I'm wrong. But I'm willing to be convinced if you can help me steel man the other side of the argument.
I'll try my best just for you. So what I would say is that you can't just start at where it came to right now, like you were talking about a neighbor who comes over and threatens you, what if there'd just been a long history of this neighbor killing all of your family members? And would you just be cool with them remaining next door to you? Especially with, let's say, the way it started is you had Jews legitimately victimized, but not by Palestinians, by other groups. And so the answer to that victimization is that they come into the region of Palestine and they start buying up land. Some of it legitimately, okay. And then some of it, all of it could be considered legally legitimate, but some of it was definitely shady. These were basically Palestinian sharecroppers who kind of thought that they owned their land, but their land was technically owned by somebody in the Ottoman Empire. And so you're having Jews buy land deeds from people who live in a different country and then coming with a piece of paper and saying, this is my land, get off, I bought it. And so, how is that fair to Palestinians? And then, if we go through more of this, I think you see a lot of, there were mistakes made on both sides. There were lots of pogroms, lots of riots on both sides where they're trying to kill each other. You had radicals in both camps. And some of those radicals became part of the Israeli government when it was formed. You had, when Israel was initially attacked, you had who were the people that could fight. A lot of them were these same people who were committing atrocities against Palestinians. And then they end up with commands over military units. And you have a bunch of offers that, we as Palestinians don't consider to be fair or legitimate. You've just kind of forced your way in here.
Yeah, we took all your land and now we'll give you 22% back.
Right. And so, from that perspective, I think you can understand it. At the same time, I think what that perspective does is if you're using it to excuse Palestinian violence today, it would be like excusing Native American violence today.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah,
I was just going to say, if the Pechanga tribe started massacring American citizens in Temecula, we would shut that shit down in about 3 seconds.
Yeah.
But it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, you have a little bit more distance in time. And I think the more distance you get, it's why we have statutes of limitations in law. It's the further away you get from some sort of initial crime. And I think this is, the decent argument against reparations too, where you would say, okay, somebody alive today, or maybe at the very most their children are alive today, was, screwed out of land through redlining or whatever the case was. I see that as an easier argument to make than my great-grandpa got screwed by your great-grandpa, therefore you owe me money.
Right.
Or you owe me land, or I can kill you. And so, some of these things in Palestine are obviously more recent, and there are, living people who experience them. So that does put a little bit of a wrinkle into it. I think a better example maybe is, we fought over land a lot with Mexico, and Mexico has turned into this state now where it is very cartel controlled. Do the people, how much of a voice do the people in Mexico really have over who's going to be in government office and what they're going to do when they get into government? And now let's say that those cartels became very, very violent toward the United States. How would we handle that? Yeah. And I think we would handle it with less restraint than Israel has handled it.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
I said this to a friend of mine. I was like, all right, so the U.S. is 40 times bigger than Israel. If the cartel streamed across the border and killed, a proportional amount, let's call it 50,000 people at the new Aztec Stadium that they built at San Diego State, which I went to a concert at to see Guns N' Roses. Beautiful concert, by the way. I think that place holds 20,000, 30,000, something like that. If the cartel came across and slaughtered 30 or 40,000 Americans in San Diego, TJ would be a parking lot within 3 months. I mean, we would just, it wouldn't even be a question. There would be no restraint. There would be no, we did take this land away from them about 150 years ago. Like, just sucks. Scott
And-
shouldn't have gone to the Guns N' Roses concert.
We're 448 times the size of Israel.
Okay, so how many people died on October 7th? Like 1,300?
Yeah, I think it's
So
yeah.
what's 1,300 times 47? What is that, about 67,000?
I was going with land mass, not population.
Oh, got it. So figure out that landmass calculation for me. No, but I mean, it's probably about proportional. If the Mexican cartel wiped out 40 or 50,000 people, which they're doing with fentanyl, so maybe we should be turning TJ into a parking lot. I'm just joking, but maybe we should have a secure border. Is my point. We would say something about it,
That's super interesting, right? So first of all, we wouldn't be accused of committing genocide by the rest of the world.
right?
So that's another thing where like,
Yeah, the Jews suck at genocide because there was like 1 million Palestinians 20 years ago, and now there's like 3 million of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard some debate where it's like, but you're killing them.
Genocide ever.
Yeah, I'm like, somebody was like, oh, but they're doing it in slow motion by taking their no. A population going from 1 million to 3 million or whatever the number is, it's drastic. It's like Jews are the worst at committing genocide. Like they fail on that. They're maybe great bankers, you could argue, and they're really shitty at genocide because they're going the wrong direction.
Yeah. And, so I think when people hear genocide, they automatically think like death camps, and that's not always what it means. It just means the real definition is also just an ethnic cleansing where you can expel people.
Yeah, a genocide could be 50 people. If there's a small tribe in Guatemala and those are the only 50 people that speak that native language of some weird Aztec dialect that's just around in this one, if you kill all 50 of those people, that's a genocide. You took away their whole culture.
Yeah. And it's also a genocide if you are maybe, in Azerbaijan and you just push all of the Armenians somewhere else.
Yeah.
Even without killing them. And, but, a lot of them were killed. And I think a really interesting lens to look at this through because, the protesters on these college campuses, they come to a lot of these conclusions through their like anti-colonialist thought. And that's something that you can kind of flip on its head because maybe Israel is one of the most successful anti-colonial movements that there's ever been. You look at the Middle East and North Africa, 100 years ago, you had large Jewish populations in all these countries. And, Morocco, Iraq, Iran. Iran had tens of thousands. Iraq had hundreds of thousands. Morocco, hundreds of thousands. Algeria, hundreds of thousands. Tunisia, same. Tens of thousands in like Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt. And all of these have dwindled to,
Effectively zero.
Some of them, it's funny. You look up like how many Jews are in Morocco still has like 2,000, but otherwise it's like how many Jews are in Libya, and it's like 3.
Right.
It's like just these 3 stubborn people who won't leave. So you had this movement by one of the biggest colonial movements, one of the biggest expansionist powers that never gets recognized as such is Islam. They colonialized all these countries in North Africa, throughout the Middle East, tried to move into Europe, got turned back in Spain eventually, and
not anymore.
Yeah, by other means now. But, that was through like literal conquest. And so you have all these countries where you have an imperialist power that has taken over these countries, and then eventually like all the Jews are chased out of these countries. They're expelled. And they were driven from their, initial homeland as well in Israel. And I think that's, some people try to dispute it, but it's indisputable that there's been, Jews there for thousands of years ago. There were Jews living in what they think of as their ancestral homeland.
Yeah, they killed Jesus.
So,
well, they didn't kill him. That was the Romans, but they sold him out.
So I think it's funny because you now have Jews taking back their ancestral homeland from what you could consider to be colonial imperialist powers after being driven out of dozens of countries. And you have these college kids who are anti-colonial looking at Israel as being the colonialist country.
Because they just equate the white people in Israel as the white people that force colonialism around the world via the UK.
Yeah.
Which is weird because
it's weird. It doesn't
Jews are not Brits.
There
are some Brits who are Jews, but
right.
It's so confusing to me. And look, I'm always trying to think about this when I argue with somebody or I'm talking about a loan scenario or something. It's like two things can be true at the same time. Like the Palestinians got screwed by all of the accords and agreements that came out of World War II. Like you can look at it through that lens 100%. And guess what? After war, borders get redrawn all the time. Like that's just the way it works. You know, Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore for a reason. And that's in our lifetime that those borders got redrawn because of war. And sadly, there was ethnic cleansing and et cetera, but nobody looks at like nobody's looking at Bosnia and would expect there to be more ethnic cleansing today or more war. I mean, there's going to be at some point probably, or Serbia, but it's just weird that that's why I always think it comes down to like this anti-Semitic undertone, because borders get redrawn all the time and people get fucked and land changes hands, and like two things can be true at the same time. The Indians got fucked and we're not going backwards. It's just, that's the way it is.
Yeah.
Let's move on to a different topic, man.
Well,
our closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts, because the Indian thing is funny too, because the Native American thing is funny too, because you would give it back to one tribe, and then that tribe would immediately be forced to give it back to a different tribe that they stole it from.
Right.
And then that tribe would have to give it to a different. But the closing thought is, I think there's a subtext to this anti-colonial ideology that colonialists can only be white, because that's the only way I can make sense of it, is that they can't think of Islam as a colonial power. They can't think of Imperial Japan as a colonial power. You know, it's this tunnel vision of white is bad and colonial is bad, therefore white is colonial. And it's, God, you used to go to college, and your concern might be, or the concern of your friends might be, that you go to an elite university with all the smartest people in the world, and you come out one of these people who overthinks everything.
Yeah.
And what we've turned into is a society where somebody goes to college and you're worried that they're going to come out over feeling everything. And it's all just based on the feels. I mean, there is, like we've talked about, there's no nuance to these arguments that they have. It's a set of learned facts that they don't have to think about, that they don't have to dissect. And instead of learning, tons of people have said, it used to be, they'd teach you how to think. Now they teach you what to think.
Yeah.
And it's had disastrous consequences. It's not just this thing on campuses. I would say this relates directly to arguments over TikTok, because, we're questioning, why are we letting China use this as a tool to propagandize our people? And I think the bigger question is, why have we made our people so subject to propaganda? Why do people who go to Columbia and Harvard and Yale fall for propaganda?
Yeah.
That's crazy. And we're doing something very, very wrong. And then we're using it to like hit on free speech, to curtail free speech on TikTok or wherever, or make demands that this be only Western propaganda and not Eastern propaganda. And it's like we've created these whole generations where the leaders thought, we'll just tell these people what to think, and then we'll get whatever we want, what kind of society we want. And the truth is that when you approach it that way, you make your country extremely vulnerable to outside actors, because nobody in your population has a BS detector.
Man, that's so good. This is a good shift to like the education system. And oh my God, I regret not filming my 12-minute drive from jiu-jitsu back to home. So my son, 8 years old, I don't remember this as much as when I was a kid, but Gabriel so desperately wants to be one of the men. Like and it's not just like time with daddy. It's like, you're going to 6 a.m. jiu-jitsu? Dad, can I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning with you? Because he knows there's no kids at 6 a.m. jiu-jitsu, because he wants to be one of the men. And he's big for his age, so he automatically gets thrown in with the older kids and whatnot. And I try to ask him like a thought-provoking question, or I try to listen to a podcast and see what he like tunes into on the drive to jiu-jitsu, and then we talk about it on the ride home from jiu-jitsu. And people are going to think I'm lying because he's only 8 years old, and God, I wish I had this recorded. But I was listening to some podcast about forgiving student loan debt. And when we were driving home, he was like, Dad, he was asking questions about what student loan and stuff like that. I'm like, and he's like, well, our president's wrong, right? And I'm like, well, you're getting that because you know that I dislike Biden. I'm like, but some people believe that once you sign on the line that is dotted for a debt or a loan, and he knows I do loans for a living, then you're just responsible for paying that off. And he's like, well, yeah, that's the way it should be. Like you took money, you should pay it back. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, and I was trying so hard to like steel man the other side of the argument, even though it doesn't come naturally for me like it does for you. And I was saying, but what about, buddy, if you went to school and you took out all this debt and then it turns out you can't even get a job to pay that debt back? And I mean, just as quick as you could possibly respond, he's like, well, that's stupid, Dad, because if you don't pay the bills back, then nobody will pay their bills. Then the banks will crash and you won't have a job. And I was like, fuck. I'm like, my 8-year-old is smarter than all these Keynesian, it's like, to your point, you got to go to school for a long time to come up with something so stupid and nebulous and esoteric that you believe in, like Keynesian economics. Well, let's just steal from these people and put it over here because that will stimulate the economy. It's like, no, you took that money away from them. That money was already in the economy. It didn't have to flow through the hands of bureaucracy. And the fact that my 8-year-old can figure that out and most of the kids on the Columbia College campus can't figure it out, it just blows my mind. So what is your conspiracy theory of why college has gone so far sideways and to the left?
I don't even think it's a conspiracy. It's the 60s radicals talked about it very, very openly. It was, and 60s radicals, not just here. I think it started with a movement in Germany, but it was called the Long March Through the Institutions. And
is that like a real thing? That's like
a real thing.
The long march through the institutions.
And the idea behind it is, okay, so these communist revolutions didn't really work out so well.
Yeah.
So what we actually need to do is we need to infiltrate all the important institutions of the country and have our people in there, have these little fifth columns throughout every institution, but especially the sense-making institutions.
Explain what a fifth column means, because I hear this term thrown around a lot, but I never really hear anybody define it or explain. It's like, you got to be scared of the fifth column. Well, like, why? It's just holding the building up.
It's actually military. So military columns, and the fifth column is a column that's actually that is pretending to be part of this military, but actually has different loyalties and will turn from within.
Oh, this makes so much more sense now. I never looked at that term. I didn't know what it meant.
Yeah, I think it comes from Egypt. I can't remember, but that's what it is. It's this this military column faking to be part of and loyal to a military, and then turning on them. And so, being a fifth column in these institutions, especially college, is so huge. When they can take over all of the academic institutions, all of the papers that we all trust, then it can be what they did during COVID.
Right.
And so that's the conspiracy theory of why it is how it is. And it's absolutely nothing new to leverage the naivety and kind of like the gusto of, nobody is more morally superior than a college student who just learned about something 5 minutes ago.
Right.
And
it so reminds me of that scene in Good Will Hunting, and maybe you could interject this, Chris, without us getting a copyright strike, where Matt Damon goes up to that college guy who's trying to, belittle Ben Affleck. He's like, yeah, that's what you're going to think. And then next year you're going to read this and you're going to think that. And then you're going to read the colonial paper on blah, 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 blah. And then you're going to think that. And then one day you're going to be an unoriginal fuck who realizes you could have got the same education for $20 in late fees at your public library. It's like,
you dropped $150,000 on a fucking education you could have got for $1.
I feel like that scene was so far ahead of its time, where Matt Damon was insulting the guy for basically having no critical thinking skills, and you're just parroting whatever the college tells you you're supposed to parrot right now.
Also, I love the Louis C.K. skit or stand-up bit where he talks about what an asshole Matt Damon is for writing that movie and writing himself as that character.
Right. I mean, fair, right? Like, if you're going to write the movie, like if you're Sylvester Stallone, you're writing yourself as Rocky, not Apollo Creed. Like, you don't want to be the asshole. You want to be the winner. I'll never forget Bob DeRosa, Christopher Overhere's dad. He told me in early 2002, I was trying to balance this whole, go to junior college, and I wanted to transfer to UCLA because that's what you're supposed to do. At the same time, I was working in banking and making a pretty good living doing loans. And I remember, for totally different reasons, not the woke stuff, not the craziness. I just remember Bob pulling me aside and he's like, hey, Scott, why are you going to college? Like he just asked that question. I was like, I had to defend myself. And I was like, well, I'm doing this and I'm going to make more money and blah, 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 blah. And he's like, yeah, but Scott, like you already have like a career. He goes, when I went to UCLA in the 70s, do you know what year your dad graduated college? 72?
He graduated in the summer of 69.
Summer of 69. So he goes, when I went to college, the goal was to give you a classic liberal arts education to learn how to think better. He's like, Scott, you're already pretty smart. You know how to think. And all college has become now is a factory for specialty learning. So you can show this certificate to get a job. You already have a great job. You're already making good money. Like, you know, he wasn't trying to talk me out of college, but he was effectively saying it's a waste. So if we take that back 25 years, somebody who was a UCLA grad telling me UCLA is a waste. And now you get like, there's a 0% chance I'm going to encourage my kids to go to a normie college right now. Like maybe if this Austin ATU or whatever, Austin Tech University takes off and it's really like a bastion of free thought and trying to get people to learn how to steelman their argument, maybe I'll change my mind.
Yeah. Or if you go for some hard science, if you're doing some like real engineering, things like that.
Even then, I'm not going to use the name because I don't want to sell her out because she's currently in her residency. But I have a friend who, you know, did her 4 years of college, did her 3 or 4 years of med school. She went through her, whatever the year or two of practical is. And now she's going to do her 3-year residency where, you know, you make $60,000 a year and you're a slave. For all of the jobs she applied for, she had to fill out these forms and write these statements about like, you know, could you serve a gay community? Do you think medical access is held back from blah, 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 blah? And it's like, what the fuck does that have to do with wanting to be an ER doctor? You work in the ER, somebody has a gunshot wound. The last thing you're going to ask them is, hey, are you gay? Do you happen to identify as Latino or Hispanic or Latinx? It's like, no, you stop the bleeding, right? Like the Trump thing. Like, I just want people to stop dying. Like, why is that even a thing? And of course, everybody who's already spent, 10 years of education, they're going to fill that out and say exactly what they think they're supposed to say so they can get the job. But it's like the hard sciences aren't immune to this shit anymore.
I think the people, whoever made that questionnaire, it just sounds like virtue signaling to me, because that could be solved with one question. Will you treat whoever comes in to be treated?
Yes.
And I could understand asking that question because it's obviously racial, whatever, you're weeding that out. But also if you're an ER doctor and somebody who just murdered somebody and got hurt in the process comes in, you're still expected to treat them.
Right.
Not even discriminating based on their gender, their sex, their race, their sexual identity. Like, you can't even discriminate against somebody who just murdered a kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that, one question solves that.
And from watching 6 years of Grey's Anatomy, I know that was already all covered in the Hippocratic Oath. So it's like that had already been taken care of in hundreds of years of medicine, like practical execution. And it's just the virtue signaling is bonkers to me. Like, I just, my kid asked me, I have a 22-year-old, he's getting ready to transfer to a school. He asked me, should I look at college A, college B? I'm like, do whichever one is online and you can have the least interaction with your fellow students and the professors. Like, just, get the certificate, have a signaling device that says you got through the 4 years of bullshit and headache. And I think he only has like a year left or something, but some weird New York bastardized thing where he took most of his classes at a junior college that he needed, which was pretty cool. Saved me a ton of money. But I'm like, just do whatever program is online that you don't have to deal with any of these morons, because, he's younger. He leans more left. He's more sympathetic to all of the social issues of the day, but he's not crazy. He's like, I got a job. I want to play Dungeons and Dragons with my friends. Like, I'm not going out to protest for the Palestinians. That's just not his lane. And for my younger kids who are 6 and 8, I mean, I really can't imagine, unless they really want to do engineering or something, I can't imagine paying for them to go to college or even encouraging it in its current state.
Yeah, I think there's some sectors where it's still valuable as a signaling device, and it's going to get less and less so. I mean, if you think that the dollar's had a few rough years of inflation, I mean, imagine having a Columbia degree in how much value it's lost over the past couple of years.
Yeah. You're paying top dollar to get a degree in some social science. where unless you meet the right person at a company who needs the signaling device of hiring the person who also believes in the same signaling devices and virtue signaling, like unless you get on that path,
yeah, if you're
good luck making real money where you can pay back $250,000 in student loans.
Especially undergraduate, it's useless. Like if you're just getting an undergraduate degree, I don't think it really helps to go to Harvard instead of University of Michigan. You know,
Right.
You're not really, because still all you've got is an undergraduate degree. So, I mean, I guess you're like really good, but of a lower division.
Right.
And where it's still worth it, and I don't know how long it'll persist, is if you're going to Harvard Law or Yale Law, you can get into one of these white shoe law firms and, work your 100-hour weeks as an associate, and then eventually like get into like a more comfortable position where you're making a whole lot of money for a lot less work. But who knows how long that path is going to remain as it is. I could see it going either way. I mean, obviously it's less effective. You're not, these people coming out of these schools aren't as good at critical thinking as they would have been 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when there were still a lot more people hanging on before the march through the institutions.
Right.
And now the scary thing that I see is like, with states trying to cancel bar exam requirements because they want more equity in law, and, equity becoming a huge part of law firm makeup. And it's been that way for a long time, but it's getting to the point where these people are no longer junior associates. And I don't know, at some point, are you a bad critical thinker who has a certain set of values, but the judge is also a bad critical thinker and they hold your same set of values, so you win anyway? And I think that's the world that largely the left, and I mean that in like a outside of partisan politics way, but the broad left, not necessarily just the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. I think a lot of them want that. I think they're looking forward to a world where it's not actually about grappling with the law, but it's about getting to this result that we've decided is already correct.
Yeah. I strongly believe that that's why the culture wars, because somebody asked me, a Democrat asked me, a Democrat who I respect a ton. He's actually my financial advisor. Really, really brilliant guy, works in finance, so probably a little bit more fiscally conservative than most of his liberal friends. He also happens to be Jewish, and so he might be getting a little red-pilled right now by seeing how some of his other liberal friends are responding to the current set of circumstances. But he asked me, he's like, Scott, why do the Republicans, because he just assumes I'm a Republican, why do people on the right care so much about the culture wars, right? Why do they care so much about the trans thing? Why do they whatever? And I tried to explain to him, just like you just did, of like, hey, are we getting to a future where the virtue signaling lawyer that doesn't know anything aligns with the virtue signaling judge? And so now that's how policy is made. And I was telling this guy, I won't use his name, but I was like, hey, Bill's always my generic name. I can't have any friends named Bill because they'll think I'm always talking about them. So I don't have any friends named Bill. I was like, hey, Bill, here's the thing. When you cross that Rubicon of like, you can no longer speak the truth that there is a gender difference between men and women, and working its way into corporate America is you have to put your pronouns in your signature line. Nobody's ever going to mistake Scott Groves for a girl, but they're not going to mistake it by my name. They're not going to mistake it by how I look or how I speak or the tone of my voice. All that is a signaling device so that the other people that are virtue signaling within our company, they can treat me a different way if they see fit, because now we're all virtue signaling on the same page. I'm like, imagine the large financial institute that you work at. What if like every Friday, all of the conservatives wore a MAGA hat to work, which would be totally out of place in your work environment? But what that really was, it was a signaling device, because if me and the compliance officer both wear MAGA hats, it's like, oh, well, I want to make this trade for one of my clients. It's probably not the best thing for the client. Maybe it's not ethical, but come on, bro. We're both MAGA supporters. Just let this one slide. That's exactly what the pronouns in the bio is. It's just a signaling device to see professionally who's in your tribe and who you can't trust. And I think that's a super dangerous future. And I saw some head nods, and I saw some "that's right" instead of "you're right," which is Chris Voss is famous. If you can get somebody to say "that's right" instead of "you're right," then you know you're making some headway. And I was trying to explain this to him, and I think I got through to him where it's like, this is the future that the left or the progressives, that they really want. They want everything to be tribal down to who you're communicating with in the workplace. And that's a disgusting place to be.
I think they also want to be able to hand down edicts that go unquestioned. So if they say, hey, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so you cannot paddleboard in the middle of the ocean by yourself, they want you to say, well, I'm doing my part. And what you're talking about with the culture wars, I think a lot of it seems very frivolous. Where it's not frivolous is I think that part of it is making assertions that a huge portion of the population is going to feel down to their very core is false. And then telling them, you have to embrace this false thing and act as if it's true and repeat it as if it's true.
Right.
There's this author, Theodore Dalrymple, who talks about propaganda, and he says that, you know, of all his years studying propaganda in Soviet Union especially, but there's this aspect to it that people always seem confused by, where it seems so obvious. Some of that like really crude communist propaganda in the Soviet Union was just so obviously untrue.
Yeah.
And he said that they're not just bad at propaganda. They realize that the more absurd the propaganda is that they can force you to accept, the better, because it erodes your sense of morals to be forced to repeat things that you know are lies. You know, when you can force somebody to say that there's no difference between men and women. Also, there's such a huge difference between men and women that if you feel like a woman and you're in a man's body, then you need to get surgery to make your outer self reflect your inner self. And all of these contradicting things that don't work together, if you can get somebody to fully embrace this whole host of things, you've got them. You've got them for whatever
you want to tell
whatever
them.
You hand down is the official truth.
Whether it's 50% taxes, or you can't go to work, or you can't go to the hospital to see your dying grandmother. Doesn't matter what it is. People will accept it if you get them to the point where like they won't even accept base, or they will dishonor their own belief in base truths.
Yes.
It's bonkers. Have you seen the whole bear versus man thing that's been going around the internet? So for context, for anybody who hasn't seen it, they've been interviewing these women, and obviously, like you said, it's the nut picking, right? They're finding the crazies of the crazies, and they're stringing together a montage of people answering exactly as they want to tell the story. But they're on the street and they're asking these women, "You're out stuck by yourself in a forest. Would you rather come across a man or a hungry bear?" And all these women are like, bear, men are so scary, men are so violent, blah, 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 blah. So I saw a meme today where it was like, woman being interviewed, and this is a meme, of course, and they're like, "So would you rather face a bear or a man?" And they're like, "Oh, I would rather face a bear." And then the reporter goes, "So you can see why maybe I don't want a man in the bathroom with my daughter." And then the lady just loses their mind, right? Because now you've completely fucked with their reality, which they know is not reality, but it's just, I don't get it. I'm not the smartest person in the room. I'm sure many of my beliefs are wrong. I'm sure many of my beliefs in 100 years, I will be on the wrong side of history because I ate steak or whatever the thing is. But like, this just seems like gaslighting at a whole new level. And I don't know if I'm getting old and angry and get off my grass and I'm just now mature enough to see some of these things and it's always been like this, but it just seems like on a whole new level.
I think it goes back to that over feeling instead of overthinking thing too. It's, this idea of, well, I've had a lot of bad experiences with dudes. I've never had a bad experience with a bear.
Right. That's your feeling.
Yeah. So one gives me an emotion, one doesn't. Yeah. It's like for me, I'd rather have brain cancer than the flu because I've had a lot of bad experiences with the flu.
Yeah. Yeah. This is Chris loves to laugh about this. He worked at Yosemite for a couple seasons and he's like, the number of tourists who go up and try to pet the bison and then they get launched into a tree because they've never had a bad experience with a bison, right? They can't possibly critically think through this 4,000 pound animal. Might be a wild animal. Maybe you don't want to get next to something that can trample you and launch you into the next universe. And Chris, how many times did this happen when you were working there where like a tourist would just get either mauled, ran over, or just launched with the from the head of a bison.
Well, you're talking about Yellowstone, not
Yellowstone.
Yosemite.
Sorry, not Yosemite.
But I did work in both, just for the record. I mean, that I saw very little, but it happened every week. I mean, but I mean, the fact that there was this woman literally trying to pet a bison while I was out playing disc golf, and I'm like, you gotta move, and she's like, mind your own business. I'm like, your safety is my business. You gotta move. And so I just started chucking frisbees at her and the bison, and eventually she left.
She's lucky. You saved her life.
She got bluff charged though.
You're a hero, bro. You saved that. You saved that woman's life. Don't let anybody take that away from you. Yeah, the critical thinking is so weird, and I just, we're made as humans to like identify danger, right? Because it's like you hear a rustling in the bush. If you react to it and there's nothing, cool, there was nothing. If you react to it and there was something deadly behind that bush, like you probably saved a life. I can't believe I'm going to tell this story. I'm going to lose another realtor or another set of referral sources. Hopefully nobody's listening 2 hours in. I walked into a comic book store the other day, and I went there with my kids. My son wanted to buy some fucking Pokemon cards or whatever. And there was a group of Dungeons and Dragons players or Magic the Gathering players. One of my friends, Mike, happened to be there. I was like, oh, Mike, what's up, dude? I knew you were a nerd. I didn't know you were this much of a nerd that you spent your Sundays, whatever. And at the table, there's a bunch of like normal looking dudes who are kind of nerdy, who are like Dungeons and Dragonsing out. And then there was one guy with a shaved head, tattoos on his face. I kind of already assume that if you have two tattoos on your face, you're probably mentally unstable. And he's wearing a dress and fishnet stockings. And I'm like, okay, my job as a father is to protect my children. I'm really sorry, but like if one of my children goes to the bathroom and you follow him behind, I'm going to be aware. But if this person follows him behind, I'm going to be scared. Like I'm going to go in there and see what's going on. Like, I'm sorry. That's just the way it is, man. And that's just like a base truth. And anybody who is a parent knows this to be fact. But 50% of the country says it's not a problem. I would not look at that person any other way.
Yeah, I think there's been an ongoing attempt to force people to short circuit any of those instincts that they have. And I don't know if it's actually intentional or anything, but it is funny. And I remember, 15 years ago when Adam Carolla was still on the radio, he had this thing where he, somebody said that it was homophobic for people to like keep wondering if John Travolta is gay and to keep like positing this, that they think John Travolta is gay. And his answer to that really stuck with me, where it's like, no, if John Travolta was gay, we wouldn't care. The reason people care is because we feel like we have an instinct that he is. And if he's not, then we have to evaluate our own instincts. And I thought that was a super interesting way to look at it. Is it's not like whatever the answer isn't what actually matters. Is my internal compass broken, or am I being lied to? Not like that it matters whether he's gay or not.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. I'm processing that.
But yeah, we've been short-circuited a lot to where, I do think that it's very interesting, and where the first reaction of Americans after 9/11 was super interesting, where I think it was the right reaction of like, we were warned that all these Islamophobic events were going to happen in the United States. What actually happened is it was like record sales of the Quran and books on understanding Islam and things like that people bought and ordered. And I just think that like there's this weird thing right now where people are so terrified of social ostracization and social death and being, kicked out of the herd, that they will deny legitimate concerns that they have. And there should be a legitimate concern with an unreformed Islam. Would just be one example, but you have all these, strange scenes all over college campuses, like we've talked about, where it is people just thinking like, oh, the radical Islamists who want Islam to take over the world, who are chanting Sharia in the UK on the streets of London, that to view that in any sort of way as something concerning, that means you're racist and we should probably kick you out of society. You definitely shouldn't be on social media. You should be kicked off of Facebook, and maybe we'll have the police come visit your house for your problematic post that wondered aloud about this issue.
Yeah, I saw this demonstrated in, again, one of these cherry-picked events where there's, a blue hair gal, so you can kind of guess what side of the political aisle she's on. She's at Columbia or NYU or whatever. She's holding a sign that says the global infantile should rule or something to that effect. And a right-wing Instagram influencer or whatever walked up to her and said, hey, would you mind putting on this burqa? Would you mind if I take your driver's license away from you? Would you mind that, I want to assume because of your blue hair, butch haircut, but would you mind if you're gay getting stoned to death, and or if you're straight, your husband has 100% control over what you can and cannot do? And she was ready to fight the guy. And she's like, just so you know, global infanticide means Sharia law running the global system of politics and law. And this is what Sharia law means. Like you can't deny that, right? Like women have no rights. Gays have no rights, right? Saudi Arabia is reforming and they're leading the way, kind of like there was the Christian Reformation. The Saudi Arabia is leading the way in trying to reform the Muslim world. And I think they just allowed women to drive for the first time like 6 or 7 years ago to get driver's license. You're going to have to fact check me on this, Chris. Look up when Saudi Arabia allowed women to get driver's license. And so if you're holding a sign...
Also look at car accidents in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, see, now we got canceled. But
2018.
2018, yeah. So 6 years ago, women were finally allowed to drive without their husband in the car. And it's like, when you're holding the sign that says global infanticide, that's what you're rooting for. And like, that woman doesn't want to live in that world. I don't want to live in that world. And it's okay to say, hey, we can be completely accepting of people who choose the Muslim faith, and Sharia law is not compatible with modern Western society. Just like the Crusaders of the Christian church would not be compatible with modern society. And they had to go through like the Protestant Reformation, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know why people can't hold two thoughts in their mind at the same time.
Yeah, if there was a large scale Christian movement that sought to go back to all like the rules of Leviticus of stoning adulterers.
I just laughed out loud. Chopping off hands, having slaves.
I think we'd be okay in being like, yeah, this needs to be reformed or it needs to be gone. And at the very least, I don't want it in my country.
Yeah. There's one group, those crazy Westboro Baptists that Westboro Baptists that like there's like 100 of them. They demonstrated all the soldiers' funerals because saying we deserve it, and they think gays should die. They're fucking crazy. They are the Leviticus Bible thumpers, and we hate them. And there's like 100 of them.
The daughter of the guy who founded it and who used to be the lawyer for them too, Phelps is the last name. She, I think, is the only person I've ever heard of who got de-radicalized by Twitter.
It's pretty funny.
Left the movement.
Road traffic accidents are a serious issue in Saudi Arabia, but they always have been.
Always have it. Yeah. They have really fast cars and poor infrastructure. I don't know.
Maybe it's not the gender. Maybe it's hard to drive in a dress.
That's good.
Yeah, if both genders are wearing dresses, I don't know.
You might be
less maneuverability. I don't know.
You might be into like, this is not correlation. This might be causation. I like this. Yeah, I don't know, man. What are your political beliefs? Because I think last time we spoke in person, and then we did that 4-hour marathon podcast when Afghanistan fell. I said something about you being a libertarian, and at the very end of the podcast, you're like, "Well, I'm actually an anarcho, blah 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 blah." And I was like, "I don't even know what that means."
Yeah.
So like, you're not voting for Trump, you're not voting for Biden, but what are your politics?
So anarchism, like anarcho-capitalism.
Wait, I'm sorry. In the last 10 years, the death rate for road accidents in Saudi Arabia has climbed from 17.4 to 24 per 100,000 people. So
maybe they just got faster cars.
Maybe 19 fatalities and 4 injuries every hour in Saudi Arabia.
I wanted to make a joke. I didn't want to be right on that.
Fuck, we're going to.
I heard your joke, and I'm immediately on Google over here.
Bro, if you just whet Chris's appetite with anything structural, aqueducts, roadways, like anything having to do with infrastructure, Chris is like a dog with a bone, man. It's like, that's the only part where he steps in is like Jamie from Joe Rogan is like, if you say anything about infrastructure or the way cities move or work, he's all over that shit. This dude knows more about the California aqueduct system than any person that doesn't work in government that I've ever met. All right. So what are your
philosophically,
politics?
I'm an anarchist, but that's and probably closer to an anarcho-capitalist, or all these terms are so stupid. Agorist.
Does that just mean that you listen to Black Flag a lot, or what?
Basically, yeah. No, what it means is that's kind of my North Star, and not in the way most people will think of anarchists, where they think of like the people in Portland who are, destroying property, things like that. there are like these weird nonsensical versions that arguably started the movement, like that were communist in nature combined with anarchism. I don't think any of that ultimately makes much sense. I also think, and this goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning, where I was like, I'm kind of for the defund the police movement, and then I never explained it. So my North Star is that anarchy, which is the idea that all relationships should be voluntary, that there shouldn't be a state forcing relationships either between us or between me and the state or between you and the state, that everything I do should be of my own volition and as long as it's not harming other people, that I think is the only truly moral position. But there is this idea of how we get there. And I think
before you go on, can I try to sum this up in a bumper sticker? I've recently seen this a lot more in like my Twitter feed and Instagram feed. And it's this meme that says anything that requires another man's labor isn't a human right. Yeah. Meaning that if I have to provide medical services for you or food stamps or anything, like if my labor has to support you, then it is not a human right. Now we can enter into that agreement individually. We can enter into that agreement collectively and think that there should be a social safety net, but that doesn't mean that you should be able to force it upon anybody.
Yeah. Opt in, opt out contracts for communism, like living on a commune. Maybe that could be successful in some circumstance. Maybe somebody could create a way where it is successful. And I think largely it would probably depend on the group being small enough that you see the direct effects of taking advantage of other people. Because people don't think about politics that way. Literally everything a politician gives you, they took from your neighbor. And that's something that 0% of people contend with when they want a new law or they want their student loans forgiven or anything like that. And so I just think that that's inherently immoral. Now, where communists and revolutionary mindset people really screw up, I think, is they think, okay, well then, if that's the moral thing, then we need to tear down what exists and then build the moral thing. And I just think, like, first of all, that's crazy because we don't really have proof of concept here. And I will admit that there's been a few Icelandic cultures in Ireland for a little bit. Like there's been a few examples of something that you could maybe call anarchism that worked for a little while, but nothing long-term, nothing robust. And I would never try to make anarchism happen without that proof of concept. And so if you go back to, we should defund the police and what we should have instead is this. What I like about agorism, which is kind of like an offshoot of anarchism, is they're all about just ignoring everyone, operating in the black and gray market, and having these voluntary interactions. So, you don't pay taxes because you're giving your neighbor eggs and your neighbor in exchange is working on your house or whatever the case is, and nothing in there gets taxed and it's all voluntary. And you can have voluntary associations and things like that. And so if you believe in defunding the police, good on you. Go make an alternative, a parallel structure that works, that can immediately fill the gap once the police are removed. But you have to prove whatever concept you have that works better than police. And then we can replace the police with that. I don't want to replace the police with your fantasy, with something that just lives in a theory in your head. And I wish libertarians would do this more too, instead of just, complaining about what the government is doing. And yeah, it is really tough when the government is taking as much money and resources from you and saddling you with all sorts of laws. But everywhere where you can create a proof of concept of this works better than what exists, then you can replace that. It's like, sometimes if they have a stadium or something, they'll build the new stadium in the parking lot of the old stadium. So then they can seamlessly switch over to the new stadium. And that's what you want to be trying to do. Build those associations, build your community, build something that if the entirety of government collapsed tomorrow, are you part of a community that could work things out, that could survive? And I think that's a much better way of going about it than living in theory land and then demanding that people just subscribe to your theory and that it be implemented at scale without any proof of concept. That's crazy.
Yeah. We've brought up his name a couple times already on this podcast, and I think he comes up on most podcasts where I talk about politics. One of the things that Thomas Sowell said that really like solidified something I was feeling, I was thinking, and I was trying to articulate and, expressed all of my frustrations as a libertarian or as an anarchist is that, government policy should be judged by their outcome instead of their intentions. And this goes back to your whole, getting into our feels. Oh, it feels good to vote for in LA Proposition HHH, which was $1 billion to house the homeless. Because, when you're going to dinner and you walk across a homeless guy and he's strung out on the side of the road, with a needle in his arm and basically dying, that feels like a human rights violation. So it feels good to vote for HHH. However, we have dozens, if not hundreds, of previous policy attempts to end homelessness. None of them have been judged by their outcome, which is homelessness is getting worse. So clearly this shit doesn't work.
And the answer always from somebody like Gavin Newsom is, what are you doing to end homelessness? Well, I've increased the salaries of all the friends of mine who work on homelessness.
Right.
It's always like, oh, what did you do to end homelessness? I took more of your money.
Yeah.
And I gave it to people who support my campaign. That's what I did to end homelessness.
Yeah. And then, in a city where if you go to the outskirts, you can still buy, San Bernardino out that way 8 years ago when HHH was passed. Maybe it was 8 years ago. I don't know. Chris, look up when Proposition HHH in LA was passed. At a time when you could still get 2-bedroom, 2-bath condos or townhouses or whatever for $300,000. Now we've housed virtually nobody and the average cost to develop and build a unit for a homeless person, I think, is running in the $760,000 mark. So just
2016.
So yeah, 8 years. And can you look up, I think there's an actual website for HHH where you can see, they've spent close to $1 billion and they have the number of like how many homeless people they've sheltered. And it's like 4,000 or something. And, they're trying to inflate this number by like, well, we housed them for 2 days and then we did this. So it's actually 100,000, but it's like, no, how many people did you transition from street living to like normal member of society? And for about $1 billion, I think they've done like 4,000 people or something. It's just bonkers, but nobody ever goes back and looks at the intention of the policy versus the outcome. And so when HHHHH comes up for a vote, everybody's going to feel real bad for the homeless people and they're going to vote for it. And it'll just be another boondoggle of like massive spending. And like, I know a lot of Americans on both sides of the aisle in every political persuasion who are pretty smart. Why can't we see past this bullshit and look at like policies for their actual outcome versus their intentions? Why can't we do that?
I think there's so much noise. There's always a believable excuse. There's always a counterfactual. I could make the claim that you could never disprove that these programs I had, actually, even though homelessness increased, without these programs, it would have increased by 10 times the amount.
Right.
So I think there's that. I think government is so big that it's impossible to watch every aspect. I mean, you think about all of the outcomes that you'd actually have to like dive into and really, people don't have time for that, and especially if you don't find it.
Because they're too busy watching the Kardashians instead of having a podcast like this.
Yeah. But also, like, if that's not inherently interesting to you, and let's just take it to like something that actually is productive. Let's say you really actually just like holding neighborhood barbecues and going on hikes and being a Boy Scout leader. You're actually doing a lot of good for your community, and those are the things that you like. And I wouldn't want to tell you like, actually, you should cut back on that, and you should spend more time on the internet trying to suss out what the actual outcomes of each policy of the hundreds of thousands of policies that we have been. I just think, I don't think any of this gets solved without a major cultural shift to more community-based independence and not being like an atomistic, I can do anything without anybody's help kind of thing, but in strengthening, your community right around you. And in not needing, I think the first step is to be in a place where you think, if the federal government ended tomorrow, we'd be fine. And then if the state government ended tomorrow, we'd be fine. If the city, and kind of working your way down to having some community resilience. I just think that kind of shift in mindset and a lot of like the new educational programs for kids that are on the horizon. I think they help a lot with that. We've gone from a society where you do what you want to do and somebody has to give you really good reasons why you can't do that for you to not do that, and move to a society where we're asking for permission before we do anything. And I think that really starts, I think that's beat into people in public schools.
Well, this ties into something, and Chris, you're going to have to make a clip out of this because I've said this to a couple people and they don't understand it. So maybe you can help me flush this out. What you just described is the reason why I've recently gone from big fan of Professor Scott Galloway, who does the Prof G podcast and a couple other podcasts, to like, fuck that guy. And here's the reason is that you mentioned earlier that like the left, whether it's progressive Democrats, they're better at building coalitions. They're better at messaging. They're better at advertising and telling the story. And until like right-wing meme culture became a thing, they were way better at dominating like the public narrative through comedy and SNL and late night shows and whatnot. And Scott Galloway, I think mostly because of the work of like, is it Jonathan Haidt, who's recently written this book about like how bad off teenage girls especially are, and how we've basically robbed a whole generation of their agency, their finances, their opportunity to excel. Well, because now this is in the public zeitgeist, and maybe he believes it, Scott Galloway is all in on this TED Talk and talking about his podcast and writing a book about how, my boomer generation has stole from these people and something has gone wrong with breaking down the family and something has gone wrong with all these children and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, no, fuck you. You don't get to vote for, publicly proclaim, talk about on your podcast and support all the things that tear down the nuclear family and, abortion on demand, making the state the de facto father, just deterioration of public schools. When it's convenient for you to make money by investing in Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, well, I've got to make mine. I got to make my money. Oh, but it turns out all these organizations are evil and we knew they were evil. It's like, fuck you, dude. You don't get to change teams midstream and say, I openly supported all the things, suing the Boy Scouts out of existence so there's no safe place for boys in this country. Being on the board of Instagram, which is like just super detrimental to teenage girls. You don't get to do all that stuff for your personal gain. And now that it's becoming like politically not convenient, because now the actual stats are starting to come out, they're like, oh yeah, maybe we have ruined the family unit and we've destroyed communities and we've sued all of the things that used to be a safe space for boys out of existence. Oh, now we have a whole generation of lost people, multiple generations of lost people. We should really do something about this. It's like, no, you don't get to do that and change the messaging that you're now like holding the banner for these people and giving your TED Talk on how us boomers has fucked everybody up when you're like the poster boy for the one that fucked it all up.
Yeah, not without a major mea culpa.
Right.
Like I want people to come over to better views, but you don't get to pretend like I think you need a convincing explanation of how you were tricked into believing wrong things or what road took you down believing those wrong things and also why you should have known better.
Yeah.
Because unless you can say why you should have known better, then maybe you're discreetly getting this one thing right, but I can't trust your sense-making apparatus.
Right. And the thing is, I suspect his sense-making apparatus is correct because in the beginning of COVID, he was calling it out as bullshit. He's like, tragedy comes, but tragedy always passes. Maybe we're overreacting. But then, of course, as soon as it was lockdown, stay at home, the tech companies, he's like, he had to be all in with big government, big pharma, because, that's his party view. And it's like, no. Your initial instincts were so right on this, but you betrayed yourself because you had to say the politically convenient thing that kept you in the right circles. And you voted for all the stuff that decimated this generation. And now you're like, well, it's a real problem that we've got, these people, these youth that like didn't get to get educated during COVID. It's like, no, you supported that shit. You don't get to change paths because like now the stream's going a different direction.
Yeah. And I'm of two opinions on this, but I think where we definitely agree is if you do change paths after that, you shouldn't be able to monetize on your new path. It's kind of like if you're great, you're coming over to the right side now, but you're in the back of the line on that side. You're not a thought leader. Like you don't maintain, I understand that you were a commander in Al-Qaeda and now that you've come over to the U.S. military, like you've seen the light. Okay, but you're a private.
Right.
You're not a commander in the U.S. military now that you figured it out. So I think that's where I am. Like, I do want people to change their minds, but I think it should take a whole hell of a lot for them to be able to become a leader in the correct conclusion that all of these other people figured out way before. And that's a huge problem, actually, where you have these kind of people who are very good at sensing where the winds are shifting.
Right.
And so they don't want to be pioneers for something they know is right, because pioneers get arrows. They don't want to be canceled. They're scared of the mob. They're just cowards. And they wait until that wave is just in a position where now they can seem like they're on the forefront, but they're really just in that, third wave or fourth wave of people who now no longer bear the consequences of having an unpopular, correct opinion.
Right. If he was talking about this stuff, 5 years ago when Abigail Schreier was like, there's something really wrong with young girls that are making them want to become boys. And, she took all the fucking arrows. And now it's like, oh, yeah, the United Kingdom National Health Service, whatever their version of the NIH, yeah. Now that they're saying, yeah, we should probably shut down these gender clinics and take a little bit more of a wait and see approach. Now all of a sudden it's like, oh, teenage girls, we got to get to the bottom of why they have this problem. It's like, no. You don't get to come along for the ride after all the pioneers got the arrows, to your analogy.
Yeah, and I think, this is partly on us too. And like you're saying, you're not listening to this podcast anymore. I think that's good. We should replace whatever we're listening to with people who have good track records and who were able to figure it out, whatever it is, from the beginning of an issue, not the Johnny-come-latelys who sense the center of gravity shifting a little bit and want to be just, a little bit ahead of the curve. You want the people who, even in the face of knowing they'll be canceled or everybody telling them they're wrong, will be confident that what they're seeing makes sense and what they're proposing makes sense, and then end up being right. Like, those are it's you don't want the Captain Hindsights, like that great South Park episode. But
Captain Hindsight, I love that.
Because there's few people that bug me more than that, than people who just are a little bit ahead of the curve and then pretend, it's like stolen valor from pioneers.
Totally stolen valor. And I have this email that I sent years ago, and going back to my analogy of, like, you show up at the car accident and there's 8 dead bodies and you're worried about whether the car was a stick shift or an automatic. I sent this email to a friend of mine, and he just happens to be somebody that agrees with me normally politically. We were talking about the gun issue and the school shooting issue. And I was like, well, now that there's actually dead kids in the school, now it's a very big progressive, Democrat, liberal talking point, and we've got to solve this and stuff. And look, I don't think somebody listens to a rap album and then becomes a school shooter. I don't think somebody plays Call of Duty for 5 hours a day and then becomes a school shooter. I don't think somebody doesn't have Boy Scouts or access to after-school sports or whatever and then becomes a school shooter. But if you look at the conservative, small c, sometimes Republican track record since probably the 80s of like, hey, here's all the things that are happening to like degrade the family, and basically put men in a situation where they feel so lost and so disenfranchised and so angry that they're willing to pick up a gun and shoot their fellow school students because they have no connection to society. It's like, well, it's a culmination of all of this stuff, right? It's the violent language, and then the violent music, and then the violent this, and then the ostracizing everybody, and then having no church, and then having no sports, and having no community group. And all of a sudden we get to this point that, like, for the most part, conservatives have been screaming from the rafters for 30, 40 years. And now we get to a point where those young men are shooting up schools, and it's like, hey, we have a major problem. We should look into what's going on. And it's like, no, we've been trying to look into what's going on for 40 years because we saw this train coming. And now that it's here, we've got to pretend like we're surprised. And it really bothers me. Like it really bothers me to my core. And I don't know how to peacefully articulate solutions to my friends that want to ignore all of the root cause and just like cut off the limb. It's like, no, the whole body has cancer. We can't just cut off the limb, which is guns, or even worse in California. Well, we'll limit magazine sizes and we'll put a bullet button on the side of this gun. It's like none of that, all that is posturing. And I don't know how to articulate this of like, not that I'm right or conservatives are right on everything, because they're wrong just as often as they're right. But on these issues that are becoming like major societal problems, if you just look at the conservatives, small c, not capital C, track record of things they were worried about, kind of turns out they were right.
Well, they're certainly right about the way that a lot of these culture issues, I think, unmoor people. They leave kids out to sea, out to adrift, and I think that's way more damaging than violent video games, than music, than anything like that. I don't know that I'm convinced that any of that stuff matters much, except, you know, maybe on the tiniest of margins. I think it's building kids who can't be confident about what truth is, what morality is, what, you know, you're and this is interesting where I'm not religious, but I've wondered a lot whether religion, even if it's untrue, is just this, you know, necessary scaffolding for kids as they're learning concepts that are too complicated for them, that they can lean on this scaffolding until, you know, internally they're kind of built and have figured it out. And then maybe it's something you can shed. I don't know. Maybe it's something you can't. I don't know what the truth is there, but I do think that the trans thing, for example, if you take a second grade class and there's not many things second graders probably feel confident that they know. One of the things they probably feel confident they know is, well, I'm a boy and that's a girl. And you're telling them on like one of these most basic things that they know, oh, no, that's all wrong. And you can't believe your eyes and you can't believe like what you think is obvious. I mean, it goes back to that, you know, propaganda is meant to ruin people's sense of truth, of sense making, of all of that. And I think you do that to kids, and it like, of course that's going to have bad outcomes where they're just adrift.
You know, I think I brought this up one time on the podcast before, and somebody's going to think this makes me a horrible parent, but in my kid's room, we have a Ring camera, and it's because of the layout of our house. And I basically want to alert if somebody's walking by my kid's window and whatnot. Anyway, the bottom line is we have a Ring camera in our kid's bedroom. And my son this is last year. So he was 7. Again, he's really big for his age. So all of the jiu-jitsu kids that he's cool with are like 11. So he had a 7-year-old and then an 11-year-old was sleeping over. And my wife tells me the next day, she's like, you got to watch this. I'm like, what are we going to watch? She's like, Gabriel and his friend were talking about girls. And the 11-year-old was asking Gabriel, so do you have a girlfriend? Do you like girls? Da, da, da. And he's like, yeah, you know, girls are pretty, or whatever stupid 7-year-old shit he's saying. And then Gabriel's like, hey, have you ever kissed a girl? And he's like, well, no, I've never kissed a girl. But, you know, in jiu-jitsu this one time, this girl like fell kind of weird and our lips like kind of brushed up against each other. And like we almost kissed each other. Right. And this is typical young boy talk. And it was so innocent and it was so devoid of understanding sexuality or anything that the idea that either of them would have a concept for like, I should be a girl, or I'm attracted to boys instead of girls, or whatever. Like, you know, maybe if my son was born gay, he would have told this 11-year-old, yeah, I kind of like boys, you know, whatever, you know, that's just conversation. But this idea that anybody could make a decision about changing their gender or thinking that there's something they're not at 7 or 11 years old, or their species. Yeah. It's fucking laughable. And it's just, I think in not too many years, we're going to look back on this and be like, no, this was child abuse. This was like the repressive memory therapy in the 80s where people's lives were destroyed because a bunch of pseudoscience crackpot psychologists were like, well, weren't you abused as a kid, Robbie? Don't you remember that one time you were a kid and your dad showered with you, which all dads shower with their sons up until a certain age, I think. And it's like, that just devastated lives. And there was famously that kindergarten that they like tore to the ground because some kids had repressed memories of there was dead bodies under the dirt. They burned those people's lives down on this pseudoscience crack bullshit. And I think in about 10 or 12 years, we're going to look back at this time in history and be like, oh yeah, what were we doing to these kids? This is crazy talk. And it's like, that conversation was so cute and so innocent and so instructive to me of like, kids don't have the first clue about sexuality. I don't know.
Yeah, whatever you think about the trans debate among adults, I do miss when we used to seem to have this like quaint idea that there are adult conversations and then there's things that kids probably aren't ready for. And you think of all of the ways that we probably, traumatize kids with things like global warming, with things, I remember when I was young, but I remember when the Berlin Wall fell.
Me too.
And I definitely don't remember, and I would have, my parents before that constantly freaking me out that Russia might nuke us.
Right.
And so some of these things too, I think like maybe the compromise we can come to with people who agree, with people who disagree on global warming, on the trans issue, on whatever, is just like, they're not kid topics. You don't need to unnecessarily freak kids out with this stuff and ruin their childhoods.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how much you think, that you need these little like, and this is something that I think the left does a lot more than the right, unfortunately, is they kind of enlist these little like child warriors in their crusades. One of the most bizarre and awful things I think that society, like global society, has done when they elevated Greta Thunberg as like the sage of global warming. Like it's just
at like 14, right?
Yeah, it might have even been younger than that. And it's just that, and then they play the game obviously of like, you can't make fun of or criticize a kid. Like stop attacking her. She's a kid. But even beyond that, it's just, there was a tweet that went viral and a friend or two of mine shared it on Instagram, and it was awful.
I already know what you're going to say.
Do you?
I think I do.
I actually I had it written down here for when we were talking about the college campus stuff, but it is a good law of history is that if you ever find yourself opposing a student movement while siding with the ruling class, you are wrong. Every single time, in every era, no matter the issue. And
my friend Robin said that to me. Like you would have wanted Vietnam to continue. You wouldn't have been on the side of the student riots.
Yeah, fun fact about Vietnam too, sidetrack with those, is that the college kids, they weren't protesting necessarily for the war in Vietnam, but they were, I believe,
you mean against the war?
No. Let me finish. I don't think they were protesting for the war, but at the beginning of the war, they were like the group most in favor of the war. And it wasn't, those protests kept getting bigger and bigger the more they kept shrinking the draft exemptions. So as long as it was poor people their age going over to fight and not other college students, there was a lot more support for the Vietnam War. And then opposition rose and rose and rose. And you could say the war wasn't going great, that's why it rose. But it seems pretty coincidental that it was the less you could get college deferments, all of a sudden, the more those people were against the war. But yeah, beyond that, every time, every era, like that is, did you see the 3-Body Problem on Netflix?
No. I canceled Netflix when they did that TV show with the little girls fucking being strippers.
That show is worth it for the first like half hour, which
the 3-Body Problem.
Yeah, it's a great depiction.
Explain the premise.
The premise of the show isn't worth explaining for these purposes, but the first 30 minutes is a really like gut-wrenching depiction of the Cultural Revolution in China. And all the people that retweeted this, all the people that like screenshotted it and put it on Instagram, like it's just like how can you be this invested in this sort of message without doing the slightest bit of due diligence or like having any idea? For example, if somebody made an extreme statement to me like that, like this has been this way every single time.
Meaning the student protesters are always on the right side of history.
Whatever. If somebody's making an extreme claim of, like whatever it is, people who, let's just say it's like Harvard students have been correct on the issue of minimum wage every single time. My first question would be like, that's an extreme statement. Have they? Are there examples of that not happening? And especially with ChatGPT now, like you have no excuse. Like, it's not even it. Maybe it would have taken 10 minutes of Google research. Now it takes 30 seconds of asking.
By the way, explain to people that have no idea what you're talking about the college students leading the Mao revolution that basically killed, 100 million people, maybe. So explain how college students are not always on the right side of history.
So Cultural Revolution starts in 1966, I think, with Mao Zedong. And it is largely, almost exclusively, it couldn't have happened without college kids. So basically, this thing kicks off at the University of Beijing. And then within the first, little iteration of it, as these people are really like militantly trying to institute communism in every single aspect and forming these parties in their school, things like that. And they're getting more and more violent. You also had an all-girls high school in Beijing as well. And they formed their own communist party. They tortured the vice principal for like a couple weeks, beat and tortured him, and eventually killed him. High school girls. And
Chinese don't fuck around, man.
They were not punished in any way for it. And then all the other students saw sort of like, these campus protests. Oh, you can break the rules as long as it's for this officially approved cause. So they saw that happen, and it just got more and more violent. And these college students instituted Cultural Revolution over the next 10 years. Probably 40 million people died directly from these purges, not nearly 40 million, but their ideas ended with things like killing all the sparrows because they eat some of the crops, and not recognizing that sparrows also eat bugs. And so then they had these, huge swarms of bugs that came in and ate all the crops, and they starved tens of millions of people.
Hey, Chris, look up how many Chinese died during the Mao Cultural Revolution and the Chinese famines. Yeah, because
there's not
100 million is a lot more than 40 million. But
they didn't keep great records, but I think 40 million is more is more on the like agreed upon side of the number.
That makes sense.
The 100 million number you get to when you include the other communist revolutions in Russia, Cambodia, all these other places.
Well, that's just because we haven't done communism right yet, Rob.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which I say, God bless you. Go have your voluntary communist society that people can opt into, and they're not slaves. They can opt out of it as well. And when it works, then, franchise it. Have more. Expand. But give me your proof of concept first.
What's crazy is we can go back to an example, I'm old enough to remember, call back to our first hour of the podcast when all of these college protesters were for Black Lives Matter, capital B, capital L, capital M. And
second worst BLM we've ever had. Yeah. First being the Bureau of Land Management.
And the college students basically led this charge of making a bunch of grifters rich. And I don't think any of them, well, that's an exaggeration. I don't think most of them made any city where there's predominantly African-American people better. They burned down a lot of stuff, caused a lot of property damage, got on the nightly news every night for 6 months. But did they donate to an organization that's actually changing the course of African-Americans in the inner city? Did they do anything to get any laws changed? I know you're not a big fan of what's the show with Sagar and
Breaking Points. Crystal Balls.
Yeah, I know you're not a big fan because they're both pretty much populist, but Sagar made
I like some popular arguments, and I don't mind Sagar as much as I think Crystal Ball, whether her positions are right or wrong, she just makes the stupidest arguments I've ever heard of.
I tend to agree. But Sagar was saying this the other day. He's like, hey, I get it. People want to be on the right side of history. They want to be righteous. They want to be virtuous. And the way you actually affect policy in this country is graduate Columbia and then go to work at a social organization or a community involvement organization, and then run for local office, and then try to affect policy that's actually going to help these people. Because what's going to happen is if you get expelled from Columbia, you're going to have all the debt, no degree, and you're going to be a barista at Starbucks where you can't affect change for shit. And Crystal was like, people should be willing to give up anything for their morals, blah, 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 blah. And he's like, no, there's a practical application here where you can actually make change. He's like, and he brought this up. I didn't even know this. So I looked up the books that he was referencing. He's like, most people forget that it wasn't necessarily the civil rights marches, the famous pictures of Martin Luther King arm in arm with people. It was what he was doing behind the scenes with the NAACP, changing policy with Wilson, I believe. No, who was the president then?
JFK?
No, not
Lyndon B. Johnson.
Yeah, Johnson. Thank you. Affecting policy changes in Congress with Johnson. And he's like, that's what changed things. It was all, obviously they had to pay a little bit more attention to it because of the protests and what have you. But it was the people that allowed cooler heads to prevail and affect policy that really made the difference during the civil rights movement. And man, they had a great argument about that. And I was like, yeah, he's just being practical.
Yeah, there's a lot of good arguments on both sides of that. I think that maybe Martin Luther King also needed the militancy of Malcolm X to present himself as the sane alternative. But something else really interesting when somebody takes the course that you're talking about is Thomas Sowell was a Marxist in college. And do you know what made him not be a Marxist?
Working 1 year for the federal government.
Yep.
Because he realized how inefficient it is.
And I think that's another, have the humility to realize that you're on a campus of ideas and theories, and they haven't been tested. You have a new idea for a parachute? Like, I don't know. People just need to have a little bit more when they realize, like, you should realize that these big changes are going to have big consequences.
Right.
And have a little humility to think, like, there might be something I'm not considering here.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm not like a revolutionary anarchist, is because there's for sure things there that I'm not seeing from where we are now, from how we grew up with these kind of institutions, with this kind of learning. And so I wouldn't want that on my head, to have all the negative effects of that suddenly be because of me. But these people don't care about that. And in the case of, back to the Cultural Revolution, I mean, those students 10 years down the line, it's really funny. And I think it's sad that college kids today don't know more about this, because they were Mao's instrument of the revolution. But because they were radical, because they would throw everything away to fight for this ideal, as soon as he took power, he thought that the Red Guards, these college students, were a little bit dangerous to him keeping power.
And killed them all.
So, a lot of them got sent to the countryside to relearn how to work as peasants. The more radical ones got sent to labor camps, and the most radical, got executed.
Disappeared.
Yeah.
I think that's what they call it in China. They're much more politically correct.
Yeah. And I don't know. It's so, back to that tweet that they've never been wrong. The craziest thing, and this isn't like a solitary example, people in universities in Moscow and Petrograd were very much in favor of the Bolshevik Revolution and helped bring that about. They weren't the primary drivers like they were in China, but very much like helped bring about the Bolshevik Revolution, which brought communism to Russia. And, civil war, death, who knows how World War II would have turned out. I mean, you can really like go down the line and look at these. And
by the way, all those college kids in Russia, eventually the proletariat found out, oh, wait, these are the kids of rich people. We got to send them to the work camps as well. Like, eventually they come for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in fairness to maybe some of my liberal friends that have stuck around this long, we mentioned that like the train of debt, for example, is rushing towards the cliff, and maybe Democrats are arguing we should go 80 miles an hour and Republicans are arguing we should go 77.2 miles an hour when it comes to our debt. Where are conservatives and specifically Republicans fucking up our country? Because I know you got plenty of thoughts on that too.
I think they accept the premise of federal power too much. That, their idea is, or even, here's an even a better example of it, because in some cases it could be power of the states. But like on the abortion debate, I think, conservatives want whatever they want, whether it's a heartbeat bill or a all-out ban on abortion, whatever it is. And I understand how much passion people can have for that side of it. I think what they need to realize is that if the majority of the country, if if what we're doing is murdering babies and the majority of the country thinks that's okay, it's not a problem that the law can really address in any adequate way. Like, you've got a huge, huge cultural problem. And what I have much more respect for the abortion groups who try to convince rather than to say, here's a law you don't want. And I think changing the culture is almost always a better solution. If, murder's illegal, and I'll see people on the abortion side, they would probably cite that in response to what I just said. But I would still say, if more than half the country thought that murder was actually a moral thing to do and it was okay, and like, really, you just have to, the guy holding the gun or the knife, it's his body, his choice, and you really just have to trust that he's going to make the right decision. If half the people thought that was okay, we've got a much bigger problem than whether murder's legal or illegal. We've got a psychopathic population, and we need to change the culture to a point where they think that murder is not okay and they can agree with the law. I think when you force a law people don't agree with down their throats, you're basically forcing them into a decision of, am I going to respect my morals or am I going to respect the law? And a lot of the time the law loses out on that. And so what you see people who don't see their values reflected in the law all of a sudden don't respect the law, and then order starts to break down, or you have people on the left saying we need to stack the Supreme Court, or you have people on the, and I think, for the record, Dobbs was the correct decision. We're just dealing with the messiness now of a really bad Supreme Court decision.
Even
not
Ruth
because
Bader
of its,
Ginsburg said
Yeah.
the legal decision, not the
Yes.
moral argument, not the social implications,
not the outcome either.
Yeah, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that Roe versus Wade was a bad legal decision.
Yeah. And so maybe there's a way that they could have come to some decision that was similar, that actually had good legal reasoning behind it, but that's not what happened. And we're dealing with the effects of people not taking the law seriously, of people seeing, this is the effect that I want to happen. This is the law I want. And so we're going to make up some legal reasoning that really doesn't pass muster, that really doesn't make much sense. And we're going to make that the law. And then all of a sudden you just degrade the law, and you degrade it further and further, the less it reflects people's values and the less it makes sense from a logic point of view.
Yeah, well, we're all up in our feelings instead of like logically looking at what's the law of the land.
Yeah, so now we're at stack the court, we're at defund the police, we're at basically like every level of law and order is being rejected in some way or another by the left. We're prosecute your political opponents. I mean, that is largely the result of not taking the cultural aspect more seriously and outsourcing the education of generations to people who you fundamentally disagree with. And then, it's what is I wish I remembered who said it. It might have been Richard Epstein, incredible attorney. I don't think it was him, but it was like, don't be surprised if you send your children to Rome and they come back Romans.
Right. It's interesting, the deterioration of respect for the law. I think everything that happened during COVID is going to pour lighter fluid on that, because all of a sudden, with waving a pen, Newsom or Trump or Biden or whomever can say, we know you have a lease agreement, but you know what? You're the tenant. I'm the landlord. I'm theoretically wealthier than you. You don't have to pay your rent for a year. Not only do we have rent control, which is just proven over and over and over again to not work, and it makes cities less accessible. I mean, that's just a fact.
Yeah, and it doesn't just not work. It works the worst. It damages the people most who it is supposed to help.
Exactly. It's counterintuitive, but it's the worst. So it's like, you just have the waving of a pen. You no longer have to pay your rent. I can no longer increase your rent. And then we have, we know that you signed on the line, which is dotted for these student loans. You don't have to pay those. Like, the idea that there is any contract law anymore in America is pretty laughable to me.
And it's even worse than that in that case, because what you're saying is, I mean, the unspoken argument here is that these loans were unfair in the first place.
Right.
But they weren't unfair by virtue of the plumber who lives next door. If they were unfair, it was unfair terms by the banks, unfair terms by the unfair actions by the university. And these universities with huge endowments, and you're going to try to say that the the person who should forgive your student loan is the blue collar worker who wasn't privileged enough to go to college, and not the university that is basically a hedge fund who, does a little bit of education on the side, because that's what the biggest universities are at this point. I mean, they can live off the interest of their endowments. It's crazy how much money they have. And if we want to say, you know what, it's actually unfair to have 18-year-old enter into a contract like this, they can't really know, they can't understand the terms, especially with our piss poor education system from K through 12. So this contract shouldn't be valid. Okay, make the university pay.
Yeah, or the bank.
Also, it's the failure of the university if you have 4 years to train this student with all these claims that you've made of how much life will be better if they go to your university, how much more you'll make, and then you're not making that money. I mean,
I heard a proposal for this. You won't be surprised because it's limiting government that solves all the problems. Take out all the government funding from college, period. Private institutions can finance college degrees, or these giant hedge funds. I saw something the other day. It was Harvard, NYU, Columbia, or whatever. Per undergrad student, their endowment is making nearly $100,000 a year in interest, dividends, and appreciation. So have them finance the students and immediately, overnight, allow all student loans to be included in bankruptcy. So all of a sudden, if the banks and the colleges have to evaluate, what's the return on investment here for this college degree? Because Scott, if we let him take out $200,000 worth of student loans and he gets a job as a barista and he can include that in his bankruptcy, we're going to have a record number of 23-year-olds declaring bankruptcy and just starting over. So that solves the problem immediately. It solves college tuition inflation. It solves the government being involved in this massive bureaucracy and funding Ponzi scheme that they don't need to be. It holds the colleges and the banks liable and responsible for the degrees they're financing. All of a sudden, cool. If you want to get a degree in Chicano female studies, awesome. Like, the banks and the college have to prove that that's a viable degree that adds value to society, because the government's just not going to finance it anymore. And if you get out with $100,000 in student loans and you can't find a job, you just declare bankruptcy. And I was like, man, normally I would be all about personal responsibility and not being able to declare bankruptcy, but that seems like a great way to fix the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that at all. I believe this country was founded partially on freedom from debtors' prisons and things like that. I mean,
yeah.
Bankruptcy, being able to declare bankruptcy has I think long been part of American culture. And, in that process, the university should be able to strip that person of their degree. They can't claim they're a college graduate if they declare bankruptcy. But yeah, I have no problem with that. It's certainly better than the status quo.
Nice. What have we forgot to hit on, man? Where are some areas that you're really passionate about on your anarchist beliefs? Like, you're like the Diet Coke of anarchists, because you believe that we can't tear all this shit down until we have some viable alternatives.
More like a turtle of anarchists.
Also, what does that mean? I don't get it.
Just slowly,
nice slow change.
Yeah.
Oh man, I know you had some notes there. What are some other areas that you're passionate about that we got to talk about?
Let's see. I do want to touch back on something that is just so weird to me. It's so strange to me that we mentioned Mexico and the cartel problem and all of that. And we go around the world looking for problems to solve. And we've got this giant problem on our southern border that we're partially responsible for.
Yeah. And
no college students talk about the tens of thousands of people who get killed by cartels every year. There were no protests when the cartels took that busload of young girl students.
Burn them to death. Did they bury them or burn them?
I don't remember. But regardless, it's so weird. How much do we talk about the Middle East in this country and not Mexico? They're right there. And if we're going to involve ourselves in the affairs of other countries, you'd think that's where we'd start.
Yeah.
Where it's close and we have responsibility for it. And, it's within our sphere of influence. Our relationship there matters a whole hell of a lot more than our relationship with, most of these other countries matter. No offense to Syrians, but our relationship with Mexico matters more. They're right there. It's so weird to me, you've got domestic abuse happening at your next door neighbor's house, and instead you decide to go to like drive to another state to address the domestic abuse there.
Yeah.
And I don't quite know what it is. So that's why it's on my mind, because I'm sort of, just trying to figure it out. And I don't know if it's easier to be moralistic about the problem that's more removed.
Yeah.
So, you can be super invested in Gaza today and gone tomorrow.
So this was really tough to like hear and expose my kids to. There was a family at our jiu-jitsu gym came over. Husband's a black belt, so he's been like teaching some classes, and we had him over for dinner. And I was like, "Hey, man, what's the story? What brought you here? Whatnot?" He's like, "Oh, well, we crossed." I'm like, "All right, man, no judgment. What happened?" He's like, "Well, we're originally from Colombia. We were working in Mexico. The work in Mexico kind of dried up for reasons I don't quite understand, or he wasn't comfortable sharing. Going back to Colombia with his, I think, 5-year-old son and 11-year-old daughter was not an acceptable outcome because of some family drama there and stuff. And it's Colombia. You can only guess what that might mean. So they decided to cross from Mexico to an actual United States checkpoint to claim asylum, which they can because they're from Colombia. And so he told me about the journey, and he has an iPhone with him, so he has a videotape of the journey. And he goes, basically, we just kind of corralled up with 50 other people, started making our way through the desert. And as we're going through the desert, we're just dropping stuff. We had a couple backpacks, but I'm carrying my 5-year-old, we're carrying my 11-year-old, my wife's carrying my 5-year-old. All of a sudden, my black belt, my gi, everything from jiu-jitsu, it's dead weight. We're just dropping it. And I'm like, did you have to pay? And he's like, no, that's why more proof that we're in the garage. Garage door just went up. He's like, no, the reason we corralled up with these 50 people is because we were trying to avoid the cartel. Because one, you have to pay them $10,000 a person, which we didn't have. And a really good friend of mine from Brazil, also a jiu-jitsu guy, he crossed and tried to pay off the cartel. Problem is he has a really attractive girlfriend. So they locked him in the back of a U-Haul truck, chained up the boyfriend, and raped the girlfriend in front of him for days until they decided to let us pass. And I couldn't risk seeing my 11-year-old get raped. And I was just fucking tearing up, thinking about it now. I was definitely tearing up then. And then his kids, they only speak Spanish. So they've been really excited to meet our kids because our kids speak Spanish. The daughter, 11, explaining to my 8-year-old, oh, wait, when you came to America, you didn't have to spend 10 days in jail? Like what? How did you guys get here without sitting through jail and whatnot? So not only is the system so broken, not only is like us allowing a porous border that's completely controlled by the cartel, unless you can sneak around, it really is a human rights violation that we're allowing this to happen, because we are allowing it to happen. The cartel, who, to your point, is right to our southern border, is a real fucking problem. They're getting rich out of their mind on this. We've had something like 9 million people cross that we know of this year. Probably 7 million of them were trafficked by the cartel times $10,000 each. I can't do the math in my head that quick with that many zeros, but it's a lot of fucking money that we're giving the cartel. It's just a tragedy of like epic proportion. And then as we become friends and we're talking to him, like asking more questions like, hey, what did your group of 50 look like? He's like, well, it was mostly Colombians and Venezuelans, but a
lot of Chinese.
Yeah. He goes, the Chinese people are kind of weird. And he's like, he didn't want to be like racist, but he's like, I don't say that like disrespectfully, but it's like what he was saying in kind of his broken English is like, they were there for a different mission. Those 10 were clearly very insular. They were not doing what everybody else in the group was doing, which is help carry the kids and find water. It's like, he didn't say this. This is me kind of putting words in his mouth, but he's like, they were this little military unit that was coming across with a purpose. And it's like, all this shit scares me as a country. It makes me feel horrible for these people that are being tricked into coming to the border because they think it's open, and then they're getting raped, abused, and taxed by the cartel. Like, it's so fucked up. And I don't even understand why this is a partisan issue, other than Trump derangement syndrome is a real thing. And so Trump said we needed a border. So 50% of the country has to say the border is stupid. And I don't understand
it's more than
how this is a political argument.
It's back to luxury beliefs and virtue signaling. It's, Biden gets to be the nice guy by being easy on the border, when what he's actually doing is incentivizing that very, very common experience that the Brazilian guy had.
Yeah.
And his girlfriend had.
Like, I can't imagine going to one of my friends and being like, hey, this policy to go down to the welfare office and report yourself. Oh, no, forget welfare. This government policy that you have to go down to the DMV to register your car and your license. Hey, there's a chance that when you do that, you're going to come across a cartel member who's going to rape your daughter. How's that sound? It's like we would shut down the DMV immediately if that was a chance in hell. And that's the norm.
But Scott, decency was on the ballot, and Joe Biden speaks with decency about the border. And unfortunately, that is how a whole lot of people, your left-wing viewers won't like that, but incentives matter, and you can't just pretend like you're the good guy by saying the things people want to hear and then not be responsible for the damage it creates. And, sometimes there needs to be the overbearing and often wrong and crass dad type who is going to say the things that nobody wants to hear. You can look at this on a whole range of issues. The nice thing is to say you're healthy at any size. That's the nice thing. It's the decent thing to say is no matter how obese you get, doesn't matter. Food is food. There's no rules of healthiness because, it goes all the way down to like this permissive parenting, which people glommed onto because it's the easy thing to do. And it's just not. But on so many issues, this is why I think the conservatives had such a bad reputation for such a long time is they weren't Santa Claus. They weren't saying the things people wanted to hear. And, a lot of times they were BS artists but directionally making the tough decisions that not everybody's going to love you for, but that are better for the country. What is your job if not that as a politician? Why are we going to have politicians if politicians are just like ratifying your feelings or ratifying mob rule or any of those things and consequences be damned? I don't know. The border situation breaks my heart, and it breaks my heart even more that it's right there. And
yeah, do you know how weird that is?
Around the world.
Do you know how weird that is to do jujitsu with a guy who I know's girlfriend was raped repeatedly to get into the country? Like, it turns my stomach, and it's sad, and it's like it goes to my idea. I've been saying this for probably 2 decades that it should be 10 times easier to get here legally, and it should be 10 times harder to get here illegally. And that would solve a lot of the problems. Because look, if we're looking at mass immigration, which America needs because of birth rates and whatnot, we could do a whole lot worse than Mexico and South America. You have people that are generally family. I'm oversimplifying here. I'm stereotyping, but generally want to come here to work for a better living. They generally are family oriented. They're generally Judo-Christian. They generally have Western values that integrate nicely with America. We already have a huge Hispanic population here that makes it easier for them to assimilate. Like, if this sounds racist, I'm sorry, but of all the populations we can choose from to immigrate to America to make America stronger, it's like you could do a whole lot worse than Hispanics.
It sounds culturalist, and I am culturalist. Some cultures are better than others. Sorry. And if some cultures weren't better than others, then we might as well throw in the towel right now because we can't improve our culture.
Right.
Our future culture can't be better than our present culture or our past culture if cultures are all the same.
Yeah. Do you think I'm trying to think through or parse out your thought of like, why don't Americans care? Do you think it's because in 2 hours, I can fly to Cabo and I can have a great experience and I can enjoy myself and I can be relatively safe and I can drink Mai Tais with my wife and watch my kids play in the pool and there's no concern. And so it gives us this false sense of the problems in Mexico because 90% of Americans that have any experience with Mexico, they've been to a resort in Cabo, a resort in Cancun, a resort in Mazatlan. Do you think it's maybe like there's this cognitive dissonance because of what we see as a tourist versus what's really going on?
I don't know. I really genuinely don't know. Like I've thought a decent amount about it, and I just wonder if the best answer I still have is that it's easier to care about the faraway problem than the near problem. It's less consequences if you fail, so it's less is on the line.
Yeah.
We saw that with Afghanistan. How many How many stories have you seen in the past year and a half of the consequences of us leaving Afghanistan?
Zero.
Yeah. It's, we can spend 20 years there, screw over all of our interpreters, all of our allies who proved their loyalty, and then...
And when we say screw over, like leave them to die.
Leave them to die. Many have been rounded up, tortured, killed, their families too. And in the meantime, this is the same president who is floating now that we take a bunch of Palestinian refugees. And it's like, sorry, where were you 2 years ago? I know they approved some visas, but like this is all stuff that could have been done leading up to our departure from Afghanistan. It's not anything that needed to be done on an emergency basis.
Yeah. Like imagine in Afghanistan, if you had control of the biggest air base in the country, Bagram, and you had
and the second biggest, Kandahar,
and you had a group of soldiers in the military that were specifically trained to take over, hold, and mobilize airfields, aka the Rangers. And just on and on and on and on. We had the game plan to take care of every single person who supported the U.S. doing our occupation, bring them to the country, give them an opportunity to life, leave peacefully. I've got a friend who I can never say his name on this podcast because he's still actively in the military and trying to get his 1-star general. But he's like, Scott, he's like, dude, special forces guy. I've been on the teams where you have a contingency plan with, 40 guys, a couple plasma torches, and a bunch of grenades. You can destroy and disable billions of dollars of equipment in a couple of days. And he's like, the fact that we left that all there for the Taliban, he's like, I just can't square in my head whether it was radical ignorance or some radical malfeasance or conspiracy or whatnot. It just doesn't make any sense. He's like, you can take that shit out in a heartbeat.
And that's game-changing equipment, and the Taliban's just giving it away to a lot of other groups too. Lashkar-e-Taiba, like all these, like Filipino jihadists, like the eventual aftermath of those decisions. It was just such an abject failure on every single level. I talked to a Marine who was there during the evacuation, and he said literally, like, what they spent 2 days doing was cleaning out airplane hangars of like empty plastic bottles and things like that. Like they were just, command heads were so out of ideas of what to do. They just told these Marines like, all right, we'll clean up for the Taliban so they have a nice clean hangar to come to. It never would have been pretty, but it would not have been difficult to make it 50 times better than it was. It wouldn't even been difficult at all. And the real thing that like sticks in my craw about it, I expect government failures, but 0 people were fired over this. Lloyd Austin's kept on, Mark Milley's kept on, like all of these people who, Joe Biden's off shitting his pants somewhere, and I don't expect that he's going to do it well. But I do expect that he still has the mental faculties to recognize what a failure it was and to know who was responsible for making it a success and couldn't make that happen. And that those people are still sitting pretty in their jobs, that absolutely kills me.
How long were you in Afghanistan for when you were in the military?
Just 6 months.
Okay. I wasn't sure how long, because I knew you were at Bagram for a while, but I don't remember how long.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we just have, it's just bonkers. All right. Let's end on a hopeful note, because I'm opening an Apogee Academy with Tim Kennedy and Matt Bedreau. You mentioned that you're starting to see some things in education where like parents are just fed up. COVID kind of took the lipstick off the pig and showed a lot of parents what public education is. I do feel that we're starting to see a correction in the vein of like more parent involvement, more community involvement. I'm going to keep going back to Apogee, the school, and Apogee Strong, and just little pockets of, we need to have a return to sovereignty. We need to have a return to critical thinking. We have my friend Tucker Max, who's very big into sovereignty. He was just interviewed on Tucker Carlson, totally out of the blue. Tucker Carlson, the biggest name in media. His people got in touch with Tucker and they're like, hey man, you don't know this, but because you both have the same first name, Tucker Carlson stumbled upon some of your shit, is really interested in your life story going from like the frat boy writing, I hope they serve beer in hell, I'm going to sleep with as many women as possible, to like now you're this devout family man.
and you're way into like sovereign living and you sold your company and you're building this ranch and stuff. Like he wants to hear your story. And so I feel like that's getting more and more into the public zeitgeist of like living a good life, right? Like creating these communities where, okay, I can't afford for the government to go down tomorrow, but you know, like they say, chickens are the starter drug to libertarianism. You know, it's like you're starting to see this kind of like counterculture to the craziness. So end us on a positive note, and then we got to go grab dinner.
Yeah, it was, I think, 3% basically of the population that really was pushed the American Revolution and made this whole incredible country happen. And, you know, Thomas Jefferson always said the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. I think that's something we lose. We expect a system to be able to just be set up and then to be on autopilot, but that's not the way it is. And the positive note is that with schools like this, anything that succeeds, you know, let's say Apogee, it succeeds in its mission of making, you know, competent adults out of these kids. It's not going to take a whole lot of kids, 3%, 5% of the country.
Yeah.
And those competent kids are going to eat everybody else's lunch. And then they're going to be the ones who get to make the rules. I mean, they're going to have more influence. And it doesn't take, you know, fixing the entire education system. I think what it takes is having something that is so drastically different and confers such undeniable advantages on kids that people are either going to follow suit or they're going to get left behind. And even if they don't follow suit and they fight against it, the people that this movement produces, I have confidence that those are the type of people then who will be able to start setting the standards. They'll be the business owners. They'll make the rules of their company. They'll build their company culture. They'll build the culture in their neighborhoods. And, you know, that's going to, I hope, I pray that's going to trickle up. I think it can. And I think it's always, you know, we try to fix things on the back end after we've already done the damage. You know, we say, well, there aren't enough black judges or black lawyers. And so we're going to promote more people in colleges. We're going to make sure that regardless of grades, you know, the white shoe law firms are induced to make sure that they have an equitable representation in their law firm. In the meanwhile, we leave schools in Baltimore to fail kids for a 7th generation at this point. And it's crazy that the idea is never to start at the beginning. Instead, you're going to take people who haven't had the proper education, who haven't had those steps up, and you're going to put them in positions that hopefully, you know, trial by fire, they succeed, but they have less of a chance of succeeding than other people do who their parents were able to have school choice by virtue of moving into a better neighborhood. Mm-hmm. These people who didn't have school choice, they don't get that. And it's never, you know, the solution has never been to fix the schools to then have that trickle up to get the kind of representation you want. Because, you know, it doesn't help to, I remember when my sister was really upset because she has a daughter, and when Hillary lost, she really wanted her daughter to see a female president. And I told her, you know, worse than her not seeing a female president is to have her see that there was one female president and she was awful. She failed at the job. That's a worse representation for a group than nobody at all. And so instead of worrying about like having people in places of visibility, like get them good, you know, comprehensive education from the start, and then let them determine where the best place for them to go is to help out society. So that's the positive note.
That's the positive note. And
is that a commercial for your?
That was a commercial for my school. We're gonna clip that. We're clipping that for sure. You know, I got to tell you this story of working on the root problem instead of the outcome. Other than dying, I can't think of anything worse than sexual trauma. And I've got a friend. We keep in touch. We argue about politics all the time, usually on Instagram. I hope one day she comes on the podcast and we can have a real knockdown, drag out fight. And I think she's been the victim of trauma, which I don't wish on my worst enemy, much less a political person I disagree with. But she has a daughter. And I've been like, hey, I would love to have some policy that waves a magic wand and ends all sexual assault. That would be amazing. And let's just accept, especially since she thinks most men are evil, or all acts of violence come from evil men, which all seem to also be Republican, but that's a different argument. She wants to fix that. And I said, yes, that's true. And I've sent her video after video of my daughter in jiu-jitsu rolling a dude off of her. I've explained to her that like the respect that's being formed between these really strong men, boys who are going to become men, who I would want to have date my daughter because one, they understand like the respect. Two, they've been in close physical proximity to a woman their whole life. So they know how to treat a woman because a rolling partner is a little bit different in jiu-jitsu and they're opposite sex. They know that their dad uses jiu-jitsu and has a lot of guns. So I'll blow that motherfucker away if he touches my daughter inappropriately. Like these are the type of people we want to build. And I'm like, get your daughter into jiu-jitsu. Not only are you going to build this tribe, not only are you going to be around young men that are learning respect, you're going to give your daughter some skills. God forbid she ever does get into that situation where she's being attacked by a man. Probably won't be able to beat him up, but she'll be able to hold him off and make it fucking hard for her to be abused. And we've had this conversation a bunch of times. She has yet to put her daughter into jiu-jitsu. And I'm like, one of two things is false. Either A, or one of two things is true. Either A, you don't believe in your heart of hearts that sexual abuse is just rampant and every girl that goes to college gets raped. And it's a foregone conclusion that every man is going to rape every woman. Either you don't really believe that, and this is just one of your political talking points, or either that's true, or it's true that you're willing to put your daughter in that situation because you're not putting her into some type of combat sport and learning how to use her body as a weapon. And it's like, when I say that, obviously she gets very irate because we're talking about children, but it's like, I just keep coming back to it because like one of those two things can't be true. You know, I just don't understand it. And I'm like, man, like you've got to change things from the ground up. We need better citizens. We need better communities. We need stronger men that don't do that kind of shit, or they stand up when something like that does happen. And then you need a strong girl that if you believe this is a situation they might be in, that they can defend themselves. And I'm like, the fact that you're not putting your kid in jiu-jitsu, if you really believe all of that, just leads me to believe that you don't really believe it. And it's just a political talking point. Now, I do believe that happens. I do think a large percentage of women are the victim of sexual assault, and we need to fix that as rapidly as possible. And you're not going to fix it with the 25-year-old who's willing to rape a woman. You're going to fix it by building stronger community-involved men and stronger women that can protect themselves against that sociopath. And I don't understand why people can't see fixing the root cause of the problem versus trying to put a Band-Aid on a bullet hole once the toothpaste is out of the bottle.
Yeah. I mean, that goes to, you used to have lots and lots of high schools. Kids would have gun racks in their car.
Right. Go hunting after school.
Yeah. It wasn't a issue with school shootings. And the other side of that is how many school shooters that we've seen so far have been confident, competent, and strong.
Zero.
I don't think any even tick one of those boxes.
Yeah. If you look at the Venn diagram, this is a very unpopular thing to look at, but if you look at the Venn diagram of school shooters, the numbers are overwhelming. Like 90% come from a fatherless home or a broken home. 90% have some weird reason that they've been ostracized, right? They're either on the spectrum or they're sexually confused, or there's something where they've been ostracized from society and they don't feel a connection, obviously because they're willing to shoot these people. And then number 3, they have some escapism that every once in a while when one of them leaves one of these manifestos, they've like buried themselves in some alternate reality of, I don't want to blame Dungeons and Dragons, but some type of weird alternate reality that's not connected to the school sports program or scouts or candy stripers or whatever the fuck kids used to be involved in. And it's just like, you can look at that Venn diagram of kids and be like, oh, these are the kids that are potentially school shooters. And it's just across the board. And I don't know why we're not looking at like, oh, if we want to stop school shooting, build better communities.
Yeah.
Seems pretty self-explanatory. All right. I have the clip from before of when you told us your favorite movie and why. And so I've already asked you that question. So now I gotta have to ask you, what are you most looking forward to going into the end of 2024? Because this will probably come out in a month or so. So like summer-ish 2024. What are you personally, professionally, politically looking most forward to besides the exciting presidential election in the second half of the year? And then favorite musical act and why? Because we've already covered the movie.
Tough question. I'll start with musical act. That's a little tough. That's a little less tough. I'd say Tom Waits.
Don't even know who that is.
He's an absolute musical genius. Has been doing stuff since the 70s, and I think he's had late stuff as I think he had an EP that dropped a couple of years ago. But what I love about him, he I think plays almost every instrument.
What genre is this?
That's also what I love about him.
Okay.
It's a little undefinable. Like you have some albums like his late 70s Heart of Saturday Night is like kind of like crooner lounge music.
Okay.
And then the next one he'll go to like industrial, like weird, like he is absolutely fascinating. You may have seen him in, if you've ever seen Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yeah.
He's the Dracula's, what's his name? Igor or whatever.
Okay.
Master, or that guy, not Igor, but he's got a few movie roles. Wrist Cutters is another one. Wrist Cutters, a love story, some indie film. But anyway, he's got this voice too, where you listen to one album and you listen to another album and you would not bet $1 million it was the same person.
Really?
Yeah. Like really like jazz lounge singer to like the most gravelly, ridiculous voice. There's a music critic after one of his albums where he did like the more gravelly voice, and the critic said he has a voice that sounds like it had been soaked in bourbon, hung in a smoker to dry for 3 days, then thrown in the middle of the street and run over by a car.
Okay.
But yeah, music lovers will know him. He's fantastic. The other question was?
Thing you're most looking forward to going into the second half of the year, which is going to include a presidential election where neither of us have anybody on the ballot we really want to vote for.
We don't, but I am still excited. I'm actually very excited to see that, even less so with the exact result of it, but like how much the results are. I am very excited for the election because I want to see how much has the country changed its mind on X, Y, and Z. And I'm excited for all, for all the polls that come out, like right leading up to it and right after the exit polls of what people said, was the issue that like really drove it over the line for them. Because I think that will give me a much better idea of whether, I can be super hopeful here or if I should start looking at property in Argentina.
Right. Like very objective polls now have Trump winning by like 11 points. Do you think it's going to be a thing where the media said, like they did with Hillary, they just get it wrong up until the very end? They're going to be like, no, there's a Biden swing. There's a blue swell. Inflation isn't as bad as we think it is. Rates are coming down. Looks like we have an off ramp for Ukraine. Do you think the media will say that and then Trump will surprisingly win? Or based on the polling right now, I mean, it looks like Trump could go to jail and he will still win by 10 or 11 points. I mean, it's pretty crazy if you think about it. I mean, this is where we've come. We've got a guy who's legitimately senile and in some stage of Alzheimer's or something similar. And then we have a guy who might be in prison on the day of the election, will have to pardon himself 2 months later as the president so he can attend the inauguration. And these are our two choices. And the guy who might be in jail, I think, is going to win by 10 or 11 points.
Yeah, it's weird. I'm excited to see how all that plays out. I know Joe Rogan keeps saying he thinks Biden will be replaced this month. If Biden is replaced, and I think there's a okay chance, I'd put it at like 25% that he'd be replaced, but I don't think it would happen until after the convention, because before the convention, it's going to be a lot more democratic as to who the replacement would be. And they'd have to actually like argue with all of the electors, the delegates from all the different states. And if there's anything we know about the Democratic Party, it's that it is very anti-democratic. In fact, whenever something has democratic in the name, you can be pretty assured that it's not. Like Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Like Biden should have been the nominee twice. Or not Biden, sorry, Bernie Sanders should have been the nominee twice.
Probably.
Based on like public polling. And then there was always some type of DNC drug deal to get somebody in who they thought was going to be more electable, whether it was Hillary or Biden. And Hillary, they were wrong, and Biden, they were right. But I think both times Sanders really should have been the nominee.
So and what happens is if Biden accepts the nomination and then bows out, then it is in the hands of, about 100 basically Democratic National Party
kingmakers,
power brokers. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they don't have to convince anybody. It doesn't have to be Democratic. It's all, the Hillary Clintons, the Deborah Wasserman Schultz.
It'll be Newsom.
I don't know.
If they do that, if they go full Monty and full anti-democratic process, I mean, Newsom is fucking what's her name's
nephew. Like that's the heir
Pelosi, yeah.
Pelosi. That, I mean, she's got to spend her money somewhere. The heir apparent would make sense for it to be her nephew. So that's my conspiracy theories. I think they will wait till after the convention. They'll wait until it's in the hands of the kingmakers, and then they will try to anoint Newsom the next king.
Yeah, I still only give that like a 25% chance.
Oh yeah. That's
The other thing I'm really excited for probably by the end of the year is this is stupid, but right up your alley is I'm very interested to see what happens with housing and interest rates.
Yeah.
I don't think anything will change in the next 4 months, but in the next 6, 8, 10, maybe
yeah.
by December, I don't know. Could be some wild stuff, I think.
Well, all I care about is that you get so frustrated with California that you move to Nevada 181 days out of the year so we can do this more often. Because I don't know how many people can sit through 4-hour podcasts of me and you, but maybe if we break it up in like an hour or two segment, we can make it happen. So thanks for being on, man. Let's go get a steak or something.
All right.